At 40, the spirit awakens. Carl Jung explains why life finally feels real. There's a moment that comes for nearly everyone, usually somewhere around the age of 40, when you wake up one morning and realize with shocking clarity that you've been living someone else's life. Not partially, not in small ways, but fundamentally, essentially, at the very core of your existence. You look at your career, your relationships, your daily routines, your very identity, and you recognize with a horror that borders on vertigo that none of it is actually yours. You've been performing, acting, maintaining a character you never consciously chose to play. Carl Jung called this moment the confrontation with the unconscious. But that clinical term doesn't capture the devastating, liberating, terrifying truth of what's actually happening. Your soul, that deepest part of you that's been buried alive for decades, is staging a rebellion, and it will not be denied any longer. What I'm about to share with you is something our culture desperately wants to keep hidden. It's knowledge that threatens the very foundations of how society functions, because if enough people truly understood what happens at 40, the entire system built on unconscious compliance would collapse. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is psychological reality that Jung spent his lifetime documenting, and that anyone who's lived through this threshold knows with absolute certainty. Here's the forbidden truth. You weren't supposed to wake up. You were supposed to keep climbing the ladder, keep maintaining the mask, keep playing the role assigned to you by your parents, your culture, your social class, your gender expectations. You were supposed to remain asleep from cradle to grave, producing, consuming, reproducing the patterns, never once asking the question that terrifies every unconscious system. Is this actually my life, or am I living a script written by forces I never examined? The transformation that begins around 40 isn't what our culture calls midlife crisis, that dismissive, pathologizing term designed to make you feel ashamed of your awakening. No. What Jung discovered through decades of clinical work and his own harrowing personal journey is that 40 represents an archetypal threshold, a developmental necessity as crucial as adolescence. It's the moment when the first half of life, the half dedicated to building ego, achieving success, gaining approval, establishing yourself in the collective world, completes itself. And the second half, the half that actually matters for your soul's purpose, demands to begin. But here's why society fears this transformation. Conscious individuals cannot be controlled. They cannot be manipulated by advertising, political propaganda, social pressure, or collective conformity. A person who is individuated, Jung's term for becoming who you actually are rather than who you were conditioned to be, is dangerous to every system built on unconscious obedience. They ask uncomfortable questions. They refuse unjust rules. They stop performing their assigned roles. They become authentic, which means unpredictable, which means ungovernable. So our culture has developed elaborate mechanisms to suppress this awakening. We pathologize it. We call it depression, anxiety disorder, burnout, hormonal imbalance, anything except what it actually is. Your psyche's desperate attempt to save you from wasting the second half of your life maintaining a false identity. We medicate it. Antidepressants, alcohol, shopping, pornography, workaholism, fitness obsession, anything to numb the voice inside screaming, "This isn't your life." We shame it. Friends and family who feel threatened by your transformation will tell you you're being selfish, irresponsible, going through a phase, destroying your life. What they really mean is, your awakening forces me to confront my own sleeping state, and I'm not ready for that confrontation. Jung observed this pattern in hundreds of patients. They would come to him in their late 30s, 40s, early 50s, externally successful, internally dying. Doctors, lawyers, teachers, business executives, devoted parents, respected community members. On paper, their lives were enviable. In reality, they were experiencing what Jung called the meaninglessness of life, that peculiar suffering that comes not from external hardship, but from internal betrayal. They had betrayed themselves, and their psyche was making them pay. Listen to Jung's own words about this threshold. The afternoon of human life must also have a significance of its own, and cannot be merely a pitiful appendage to life's morning. Let that sink in. The afternoon of human life, everything from 40 onward, must have its own significance. It cannot simply be more of the same. You cannot take the strategies, values, and goals that worked in your 20s and 30s and just keep applying them for another 40 years. That's not life. That's repetition. That's death disguised as existence. The transformation at 40 is nature's way, or if you prefer Jung's language, the self's way, of ensuring you don't waste your entire incarnation performing a role. It's a psychological imperative as powerful as hunger or the sex drive. Your soul demands expression. Your shadow demands integration. Your unlived life demands recognition. And around 40, these forces become so powerful that they can no longer be suppressed without severe consequences. Those consequences are everywhere if you know how to look. The businessman who has a heart attack at 45. The devoted mother who develops autoimmune disease at 43. The teacher who descends into alcoholism at 48. The executive who suddenly leaves his family for a 25-year-old. The wife who, after 20 years of marriage, files for divorce with a coldness that shocks everyone. These aren't random events. These are psyches, last resort interventions when the message has been ignored too long. But, and this is crucial, the transformation doesn't have to be destructive. When you understand what's happening, when you recognize the awakening for what it is, when you consciously engage with the process Jung called individuation, this threshold becomes not a crisis, but an initiation. The second half of your life becomes not a sad decline, but a profound deepening. You finally begin living your life instead of the life you inherited, the life you were told to want, the life that looks good from the outside, but feels dead from the inside. Over the next 2 hours, I'm going to guide you through Jung's understanding of this 40-year threshold with a level of depth and detail you won't find anywhere else. We're going to examine exactly what's happening in your psyche during this transformation. We're going to look at real case studies of people who've navigated this passage, some successfully, some catastrophically. We're going to explore the concepts Jung spent his lifetime developing: the persona, the shadow, the anima and animus, the self. And most importantly, we're going to examine what this transformation reveals about you. Because here's the thing, if you're watching this video, you're either approaching this threshold, in the middle of it, or reflecting back on it, and your response to what I'm teaching reveals your current psychological state as clearly as an X-ray reveals broken bones. The parts you resist will show you what you're defending. The parts that make you angry will show you what you're denying. The parts that bring tears will show you what you've been burying. This isn't just information about 40-year transformation. This is a mirror being held up to your soul. Are you ready to look? Are you ready to see what you've been avoiding? Are you ready to understand why that vague restlessness you feel, that sense of, is this all there is? That growing certainty that something fundamental needs to change? Why all of that isn't pathology but prophecy? Your soul trying to tell you the time has come. The false self must die so the true self can finally be born. Jung also said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, not who your parents wanted you to be, not who your spouse needs you to be, not who society rewards you for being, who you truly are. And that privilege, that sacred responsibility begins in earnest around the age of 40. This is when the spirit awakens. This is when life finally feels real. This is when you finally, if you're brave enough to answer the call, begin living your actual existence. Let's begin. To understand what happens at 40, you first need to understand what you've been doing for the previous 40 years. And the answer, uncomfortable as it is this. You've been building a prison and then locking yourself inside it. Jung called this prison the persona, the social mask, the character you present to the world, the identity you constructed to gain approval, avoid rejection, achieve success, and navigate the collective demands of family, culture, and society. Let me be very clear about something. The persona isn't inherently bad. It's necessary. A child cannot survive without learning to adapt to their environment. A teenager cannot develop without establishing an identity separate from their parents. A young adult cannot thrive without creating professional competence, social skills, and a coherent sense of self they can present to the world. The persona serves crucial functions. It allows you to get a job, form relationships, participate in culture, achieve goals. It's the face you wear when you show up for life's first half. The problem, and this is where most people get trapped, is that somewhere along the way, you forget it's a mask. You become so identified with the persona that you mistake it for your actual self. The role becomes the reality. The character becomes the person. And everything that doesn't fit the persona, all your authentic desires, your shadow qualities, your unconventional impulses, your soul's actual calling, gets buried, repressed, locked away in the basement of your psyche where it can't threaten your carefully constructed identity. Think about how this happens. You're born with a full spectrum of potential, creative and logical, gentle and fierce, introverted and extroverted, spiritual and practical, orderly and chaotic. You're born whole. But then life begins its shaping process. Your family has expectations. Boys don't cry. Girls should be nice. We're a family of doctors. We don't talk about feelings. Success means money. Your culture adds its layers. Real men are tough. Good women are selfless. Intelligence means degrees. Happiness means marriage and children. Your social class, your religion, your ethnicity, your historical moment, all of these forces tell you who you're supposed to be. And because you're young, because you need love and belonging, because rejection feels like death when you're developing, you comply. You learn which parts of yourself are acceptable and which must be hidden. You develop your persona, the version of yourself that gets rewarded, that gains approval, that feels safe. Maybe your persona is the successful professional, competent, ambitious, reliable, emotionally controlled. Maybe it's the devoted mother, selfless, nurturing, endlessly available, never angry. Maybe it's the good son, obedient, respectful, living out his father's unlived dreams. Maybe it's the rebel, and yes, rebellion can be a persona too, a predictable identity built in reaction to expectations rather than authentic self-knowledge. Whatever your particular persona, it becomes your operating system. You make choices based on what fits the mask. Career decisions. Will this make me look successful? Relationship choices. Does this person match the image I'm projecting? Daily behavior. Am I acting the way someone like me should act? You start living not from your center, not from your authentic self, but from this constructed identity that exists primarily in your imagination and in other people's perceptions. Here's where it gets truly painful. The persona requires constant maintenance. Think about it. How much energy do you spend every single day managing your image, curating your social media to show the right version of your life, dressing the part, speaking carefully so you don't reveal anything that contradicts your established character, suppressing emotions that don't fit? The successful executive can't show fear. The devoted mother can't show rage. The spiritual seeker can't show pettiness. The rational scientist can't show mystical longings. You become a performer in your own life, eternally worried about dropping the mask, eternally exhausting yourself with the performance. And what happens to everything else? All the parts of you that don't fit the persona. Jung had a name for that too, the shadow. Your shadow is everything you had to exile from conscious identity to maintain your mask. If your persona is nice, your shadow contains your anger, your selfishness, your capacity for cruelty. If your persona is strong, your shadow contains your vulnerability, your need for comfort, your softness. If your persona is rational, your shadow contains your irrationality, your superstitions, your mystical experiences. If your persona is wild and free, your shadow contains your need for structure, your conventional desires, your longing for stability. For the first 40 years, most people successfully suppress their shadow. You keep it locked away. You don't look at it. You definitely don't admit it exists. And when you do catch glimpses of it, in dreams, in moments of intense emotion, in behaviors you can't quite explain, you feel shame. Because the shadow doesn't just contain morally neutral qualities you've repressed. It also contains everything dark, everything you're ashamed of, everything that terrifies you about yourself. This is the architecture of the first half. Persona above, shadow below. Ego, your conscious mind, identified entirely with the persona and defending desperately against the shadow. It's a split existence, a divided self. And it works until it doesn't. Jung observed that this split becomes unsustainable around 40. Why? Because by then, you've usually achieved, or definitively failed to achieve, the goals your persona was designed to accomplish. You've climbed the career ladder, or accepted you won't. You've married and had children, or accepted you won't. You've established your place in society, or realized you're always going to be an outsider. The first half projects are complete, and then comes the devastating question, what now? If I achieved everything I was supposed to want, why do I feel so empty? And if I failed to achieve what I was supposed to want, why do I feel relieved? This is the moment the mask starts cracking. The persona that served you for 40 years suddenly feels like a straitjacket. The life that looked so good from outside feels unbearably false from inside, and you begin to experience what Jung called the symptoms of unlived life: depression that has no external cause, anxiety that won't respond to medication, physical illnesses that doctors can't explain, relationship problems that counseling can't fix, addictions that suddenly intensify, dreams that become vivid and disturbing, a sense of meaninglessness that makes getting out of bed feel impossible. Listen to Jung. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But you can't become who you truly are while you're imprisoned in who you pretended to be. The persona must die. The mask must crack. The false self must be exposed as false. And that process, that dying before you die, is what triggers what our culture wrongly calls midlife crisis. It's not a crisis, it's a calling. Your soul, yourself, that totality of your psyche that's so much larger than your conscious ego, is demanding recognition. It's saying, I gave you 40 years to play the game, to prove yourself, to achieve the things the collective world values. Now it's my turn. Now we do the real work. Now you finally start living your life. But here's the tragedy. Most people never answer that call. They experience the symptoms, the depression, the restlessness, the vague sense that something's deeply wrong. But instead of understanding it as an initiation, they treat it as a problem to be solved. They go to the doctor and get antidepressants. They go to the bar and get drunk. They have an affair to feel alive. They buy a sports car to recapture youth. They double down on work to avoid the feelings. They start a brutal fitness regimen to control something, anything. They do anything and everything except the one thing that would actually address the crisis. Stop maintaining the persona and start discovering who they actually are beneath the mask. This is the problem at the core of the 40-year transformation. You've spent your entire life building and maintaining a false self. You've achieved success, gained respect, created stability, all of it based on a character you're playing rather than a person you're being. And now your psyche is screaming at you that the second half cannot be more of the same. You cannot spend another 40 years performing. You cannot waste your remaining time on Earth living someone else's script. The question is, will you listen? Will you allow the persona to crack? Will you be willing to face the shadow you've spent 40 years avoiding? Will you risk everything you've built? The respect, the identity, the security, the relationships based on your mask for something you can't even name yet? Your authentic self? Most won't. They'll medicate the symptoms, suppress the awakening, and continue the performance until they die, comfortable, respected, accomplished, and utterly unfulfilled. But if you're still watching, if something in you is recognizing this pattern, if you feel that electric jolt of, oh God, he's describing my life, then maybe, just maybe, you're one of the ones who will actually do the work. The work of becoming who you truly are, the work of integration rather than performance, the work of wholeness rather than perfection, the work that begins in earnest around 40 and continues until you die, not as tragedy, but as the only thing worth doing with a human life. Let me tell you about David, not his real name, but his real story, a story that perfectly illustrates what happens when the persona finally, catastrophically, necessarily breaks. David was 42 years old, a partner in a prestigious corporate law firm in Manhattan, 6-figure salary, corner office with views of Central Park, beautiful brownstone in Brooklyn, wife who worked in publishing, 2 children in private school, country house in the Berkshires. From any external measure, David had won at life. He was exactly where a man of his background, intelligence, and work ethic was supposed to be. Except David couldn't breathe anymore. That's how he described it in his first therapy session. Not with a Jungian analyst initially, but with a conventional therapist who ultimately referred him to someone trained in depth psychology. Because David's problem wasn't responding to cognitive behavioral therapy or medication. I feel like I'm suffocating, David said, like there's a weight on my chest every morning when I wake up, like I'm underwater and can't reach the surface. The therapist noted David had all the symptoms of severe depression: difficulty sleeping, loss of appetite, inability to concentrate, pervasive sense of dread. But when they explored external stressors, work pressure, financial problems, marital issues, health concerns, there was nothing acute. Yes, David worked long hours, but he always had. Yes, his marriage had grown somewhat distant, but it wasn't in crisis. His children were healthy and doing well. His finances were secure. By every conventional measure, David should have been fine. But David wasn't fine. David was dying inside while his external life hummed along smoothly, and that disconnect between outer success and inner death is precisely what Jung recognized as the symptom of persona imprisonment. Then came David's 42nd birthday. His wife threw him a party, tasteful, well-attended, all the appropriate people present. David stood in his beautiful home, surrounded by colleagues and friends, accepting congratulations and well wishes, and felt absolutely nothing. Worse than nothing, he felt like a ghost at his own life, watching from somewhere outside himself as this character named David the successful attorney performed the role of gracious host. That night, after everyone left, after his wife went to bed, David sat alone in his study with a bottle of bourbon and asked himself a question he'd been avoiding for years. If I died tomorrow, would I feel like I'd lived my life? And the answer that came back, immediate, devastating, undeniable, was no. No, I haven't lived my life. I've lived a script. I've performed a role. But I, whoever I actually am, have never existed. That question broke something in David, or rather it broke the illusion that had been holding David together. Within a week, he began having panic attacks at work, full-blown debilitating episodes where he couldn't catch his breath, his vision tunneled, his heart raced, and he was certain he was dying. He'd have to leave meetings, lock himself in the bathroom, wait for the terror to pass. Within 2 weeks, he couldn't go to the office at all. Just the thought of putting on his suit, taking the subway, sitting at his desk, made him physically ill. His firm was understanding at first. Take some time, see a doctor. We all need mental health breaks. But as days became weeks, concern turned to pressure. David was a partner. He had responsibilities. He couldn't just stop showing up. But David couldn't go back. The persona had fractured, and there was no putting it back together. Every time he tried, put on the suit, picked up his briefcase, his body revolted, shaking, nausea, the feeling of suffocation returning with crushing intensity. This is when David started having the dreams. The first dream was the one that changed everything. David dreamed he was at the office, but when he looked down at himself, he realized he was wearing medieval armor, full plate armor so heavy he could barely move. Every step was exhausting. He was trying to attend a meeting, trying to work, but the armor made everything impossible. He couldn't sit down, couldn't use his hands, couldn't speak clearly through the helmet. Everyone else was staring at him like he was insane, but David couldn't get the armor off. He was trapped inside it. Then, in the dream, a child appeared. A young boy, maybe 10 years old. The boy walked right up to David, looked into the helmet where David's face was barely visible, and asked, "Why did you abandon me?" The boy was crying, and David, looking at the boy's face, realized with absolute horror. The child was him at age 10, the boy he used to be. David woke up sobbing, deep, wrenching sobs he hadn't allowed himself since childhood. And in that moment of raw emotion, a memory surfaced that he'd successfully suppressed for 32 years. David was 10 years old, sitting in his room, working on a painting. He loved to paint, watercolors mostly, scenes from his imagination, fantastical landscapes, expressive portraits. He wasn't particularly good at it by any objective measure, but he was passionate. It made him feel alive, connected, himself. His father came into the room. David's father was an attorney, successful, respected, powerful in their community, the kind of man who wore his accomplishments like armor. He looked at David's painting, looked at David, and said, "That's a nice hobby, son, but when you grow up, you'll need a real career. You'll be a lawyer like me. That's what men in our family do." And 10-year-old David, who desperately wanted his father's approval, who needed his father's love, made a decision in that moment, a decision he didn't even consciously realize he was making. He decided to become who his father needed him to be. He stopped painting. He focused on academics. He joined the debate team. He went to law school. He built an entire life around being the person his father wanted. And the real David, the sensitive boy who loved color and beauty and creative expression, who was intuitive and artistic and maybe a little too soft for his father's taste, that David was locked away, exiled, buried alive in the shadow. This is what Jung meant when he talked about the unlived life, the life that should have been yours but was sacrificed to maintain the persona, to gain approval, to fulfill collective expectations. For 32 years, David's true self had been imprisoned while the persona, David the successful attorney, ran the show. And now, at 42, that imprisoned self was demanding recognition through panic attacks, through depression, through physical symptoms, through dreams, through the complete collapse of David's ability to maintain the persona. The authentic David was breaking out of prison, and if that meant destroying everything the false David had built, so be it. This is what Jung called the confrontation with the unconscious. Not a comfortable, gradual awakening, but a shattering, a psychic emergency, the breakdown of the ego's defenses, and the eruption of everything that's been suppressed. David's marriage didn't survive. His wife had married David the attorney, and when that David disappeared, she couldn't relate to the man who was emerging. She tried to be supportive, but there was anger there too. You're throwing away everything we built. You're being selfish. You're abandoning your responsibilities. What she couldn't see was that David wasn't choosing this. This was happening to him, or more accurately, this was his deepest self finally, desperately, asserting its right to exist. David left the firm, bought out of his partnership, used the money to take 2 years off, not to rest, but to do the hardest work of his life, figuring out who he actually was beneath 42 years of performing. He went into Jungian analysis. 3 times a week, he sat with an analyst who understood what was happening, not pathology, but initiation. Together they worked with David's dreams, which became increasingly vivid. They traced the patterns of his life, seeing clearly how every major decision had been made by the persona, never by his authentic self. They did what Jung called active imagination, dialoguing with the different parts of David's psyche, including that 10-year-old boy who'd been abandoned. And slowly, painfully, something new began to emerge. Not the old David, the attorney, and not a simple return to childhood dreams, but something third, an integrated David who could hold both the discipline and competence he'd developed and the sensitivity and creativity he'd buried. 3 years after his breakdown, David was teaching art therapy to veterans with PTSD. He'd gone back to school, gotten trained, found work that actually used his authentic gifts rather than his constructed persona. His income was a fraction of what it had been. His second marriage was to a woman who knew the real him from the beginning. His relationship with his adult children was complicated. They'd been angry about the divorce, about the disruption, but slowly healing. When asked if he regretted the transformation, David said something I'll never forget. "I regret that it took 42 years. I regret that I abandoned myself for 3 decades. But the breakdown, the shattering, that saved my life. I wasn't living before, I was performing. Now I'm living. Even with all the loss, all the difficulty, I'm finally living my actual life." This is what Jung meant when he said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." It's not comfortable, it's not easy. It costs you everything the false self built. But the alternative, continuing the performance for another 40 years until you die without ever having lived, that's not an option once the awakening begins. David's story isn't unique, it's archetypal. The details vary, different careers, different masks, different forms of breakdown. But the pattern is the same. The persona maintained for 40 years, the shadow pressing for recognition, the crisis that looks like catastrophe but is actually breakthrough, the painful dismantling of the false life, the slow emergence of authentic identity. If you're watching this and recognizing yourself in David's story, pay attention. Your psyche is trying to tell you something. The restlessness you feel, the depression that won't lift, the sense that something fundamental is wrong. These aren't symptoms to be medicated away. They're your soul demanding that you stop abandoning yourself. They're the beginning of your own confrontation with the unconscious. The question is, will you answer the call? Or will you spend another decade, 2 decades trying to force the persona back together, trying to suppress what can no longer be suppressed? Because here's what Jung discovered. Once the awakening begins, there's no going back to sleep. You can only move forward through the transformation, or resist it until it destroys you. There is no third option. Before we go deeper into what happens when the persona shatters at 40, we need to understand why the persona exists in the first place. Because contrary to what it might seem, Jung didn't view the first half of life as a mistake or a waste. He saw it as absolutely necessary, a developmental stage as essential as childhood itself. You cannot skip the first half and jump straight to individuation. You cannot transcend what you haven't first built. Let me explain the architecture of life's first half as Jung understood it, because this will help you comprehend both why 40 becomes such a crucial threshold and why resisting the transformation is so damaging. Jung divided human life into two fundamental phases, and the division point sits roughly around age 40. The first phase, birth to approximately 40, is what he called the stage of ego development and persona formation. The second phase, 40 onward, is the stage of individuation and integration. These aren't arbitrary divisions. They reflect actual psychological development that Jung observed across hundreds of patients and thousands of years of human myth and religious tradition. Let's start with the first phase. When you're born, you don't have an ego. You have no sense of being a separate individual. An infant exists in what Jung called participation mystique, complete merger with the mother, with the environment, with everything. There's no I yet, just undifferentiated consciousness, pure potential, wholeness without self-awareness. The entire project of childhood and adolescence is building an ego, that sense of I, that center of conscious identity that can say, I am me, separate from you, a distinct individual with my own thoughts, feelings, and will. This is crucial development. Without a strong ego, you cannot function in the world. You cannot make decisions, set boundaries, pursue goals, or protect yourself. The ego is your operating system for navigating consensus reality. Alongside ego development comes persona formation. Remember, persona means mask in Latin. It's the face you show the world, and every child must learn to adapt to their environment. You must learn which behaviors get you love and which get you rejected. You must develop social skills. You must figure out how to be successful in your particular cultural context. The persona is how you interface with the collective world. Think about how this happens practically. A child is born with their full range of human potential, capable of strength and tenderness, aggression and cooperation, logic and intuition, order and chaos. But then socialization begins. Your family has particular values, and they reward behaviors that align with those values while punishing behaviors that don't. If you grow up in a family that values intellectual achievement, you'll develop your thinking function and receive approval for being smart. If you grow up in a family that values emotional expression, you'll develop your feeling function and receive approval for being sensitive. If you grow up in a family that values stoic strength, you'll learn to suppress vulnerability and receive approval for being tough. Your culture adds more layers. Gender expectations. Boys should be this way. Girls should be that way. Class expectations. Working class people should be practical. Upper class people should be cultured. Religious expectations. Pious behavior looks like this. Sinful behavior looks like that. Every social system you inhabit has its requirements, and you learn to meet them. By the time you reach young adulthood, late teens, early 20s, you've developed a coherent persona, a version of yourself that can successfully navigate your world. Maybe you're the achiever, driven, competitive, focused on success. Maybe you're the caretaker, selfless, nurturing, always available to help others. Maybe you're the intellectual, analytical, articulate, living in the realm of ideas. Maybe you're the free spirit, creative, unconventional, rejecting mainstream values. Whatever your particular persona, it works. It gets you through school. It helps you find jobs. It enables relationships. It gives you an identity you can present to the world. And this is important. Jung insisted this development isn't wrong or bad. It's necessary. A person who never develops a strong ego remains psychologically infantile, unable to function independently, constantly overwhelmed by unconscious material, lacking the strength to pursue goals or maintain boundaries. A person who never develops a functional persona remains socially incompetent, unable to hold jobs, form stable relationships, or operate successfully in collective contexts. The first half of life has clear, essential tasks. First, develop a strong ego so you can function as an autonomous individual. Second, build a viable persona so you can interface with society. Third, establish yourself in the external world. Get educated, build a career, form relationships, create financial security, perhaps start a family, earn respect and recognition in your community. These are real achievements. Jung honored them. A 40-year-old who successfully completed the first half tasks has something to show for it: professional competence, relationship skills, psychological stability, social standing, material security. They've proven they can function in the world. This foundation is necessary for what comes next. But, and this is absolutely crucial, the methods that work in the first half stop working in the second half. The goals that motivate the first half become meaningless in the second half, and attempting to simply continue first half strategies for another 40 years leads to what Jung called the sterility of a life stuck in the morning phase. Here's why. The first half is oriented outward. You're focused on external achievement, on proving yourself to the world, on gaining recognition from others, on accumulating resources and status. Your value comes from outside yourself, from your accomplishments, your roles, others' opinions. You measure success by external metrics: salary, title, square footage of house, number of degrees, social media followers, attractiveness of spouse. You're climbing ladders that someone else built, pursuing goals that culture told you to want, seeking approval from authorities you never questioned. This external orientation is perfect for the first half. A 25-year-old should be focused on building career skills, proving their competence, establishing themselves. A 35-year-old should be focused on advancing professionally, creating stability, perhaps raising children. These outward-facing goals make sense when you're young, but around 40, something shifts, and Jung observed this shift was universal across cultures, time periods, and individual circumstances. It's not caused by any particular event. It's developmental, it's archetypal, it's the natural completion of one phase and the beginning of another. What shifts? First, mortality becomes real. When you're young, death is abstract. Yes, you know intellectually that you'll die someday, but it doesn't feel real. You have decades ahead. Time feels infinite, but around 40, you start doing the math. If you're 40 and you live to 80, you have 40 years left, and those 40 years will go faster than the first 40. You're past the midpoint. The end is no longer abstract. It's visible on the horizon. This mortality awareness changes everything. Suddenly, wasting time matters. Living inauthentically matters. Pursuing goals you don't actually care about matters, because time is limited and every day spent maintaining a false self is a day of your actual life you'll never get back. Second, external achievements lose their power to satisfy. The promotions, the house upgrades, the prestigious awards, they stop delivering the sense of fulfillment they once promised. You reach the goals you set in your 20s and 30s and discover they're hollow. Or you fail to reach those goals and discover you don't actually care as much as you thought you did. Either way, the external game stops working. Jung saw this in patient after patient. They'd achieved everything they set out to achieve, became the successful lawyer, the respected doctor, the devoted parent, the community leader, and found themselves utterly empty. Or they'd failed to achieve what they set out to achieve, and instead of devastation, felt a strange sense of relief. because the persona they'd been maintaining was never actually theirs. Third, the unlived life starts demanding recognition. All those parts of yourself you suppressed to build your persona, the creativity you buried to be practical, the wildness you tamed to be responsible, the sensitivity you hardened to be strong, the authority you softened to be likable. All of that shadow material has been accumulating pressure for 40 years. And around 40, the container can't hold it anymore. The dam breaks. What you've denied demands acknowledgement. This is why Jung said, thoroughly unprepared, we take the step into the afternoon of life. Worse still, we take this step with the false presupposition that our truths and our ideals will serve us as hitherto. We assume the second half will be like the first half, just continued. We think we'll just keep climbing the same ladders, pursuing the same goals, maintaining the same persona. But the psyche has different plans. The second half requires a complete reorientation, from external to internal, from achievement to meaning, from persona to self, from ego inflation to ego integration, from unconscious living to conscious existence. And this reorientation cannot happen while you're still identified with your persona. The mask must crack. The false self must be exposed as false. Everything you built in the first half must be questioned. This doesn't mean destroying everything. You don't have to quit your job, divorce your spouse, abandon your children, and move to an ashram. Some people need radical external changes, others don't. What must change is internal, your relationship to your persona, your willingness to face your shadow, your orientation from external validation to internal authority. But here's the tragedy Jung witnessed repeatedly. Most people never make this shift. They reach 40, experience the symptoms of transformation, the restlessness, the depression, the sense that something's wrong. And they respond by doubling down on first-half strategies. They chase a bigger promotion, thinking more success will satisfy them. They have an affair, thinking a new relationship will make them feel alive. They buy expensive toys, thinking material goods will fill the emptiness. They throw themselves into fitness or appearance maintenance, thinking if they can just stay young-looking, they can avoid the reckoning. None of it works, because the problem isn't external. It's not that you don't have enough success, enough excitement, enough stuff, enough youth. The problem is that you're still trying to live from persona rather than self. You're still seeking external validation rather than internal authority. You're still running from your shadow rather than integrating it. You're still unconscious when your soul is demanding consciousness. Jung was particularly critical of people who remained stuck in first-half consciousness, beyond its natural completion. He saw it as not just personally tragic, but collectively dangerous. A 50-year-old still chasing status, like a 25-year-old, becomes rigid, defensive, unable to grow. A 60-year-old still maintaining their persona with desperate intensity becomes brittle, judgmental, projecting their unlived life onto everyone around them. These are the people who become bitter in old age, who look back with regret, who die having never actually lived their own life. Conversely, Jung observed that people who successfully navigate the 40-year threshold and enter genuine individuation become more themselves with each passing year. They grow more authentic, more integrated, more capable of holding complexity and paradox. They stop performing and start being. They withdraw their projections and see others clearly. They develop genuine wisdom rather than just accumulated knowledge. They become sources of guidance for others, not through preaching, but through embodied authenticity. This is the architecture of Jung's map. First half for ego development and persona formation. Second half for shadow integration and individuation. Both halves are necessary. You cannot skip the first and jump to the second. But you also cannot remain in the first when the second is calling, and 40 is when that call becomes impossible to ignore. So the question becomes, have you completed the first half tasks? Have you developed a strong enough ego to survive the persona's dissolution? Have you established enough external stability that you can afford to turn inward? Have you proven to yourself and the world that you can function successfully in consensus reality? If yes, then the second half is calling you. The symptoms you're experiencing, the restlessness, the dissatisfaction, the sense that something fundamental needs to change, aren't pathology. They're your psyche telling you it's time. Time to stop building outward and start exploring inward. Time to stop proving yourself and start knowing yourself. Time to stop performing and start being. If you never successfully built an ego, never developed a functional persona, never established yourself in the world, then you have different work to do. You can't individuate from a persona you never built. You first need to complete the first half tasks, even if you're already past 40 chronologically. But for most people watching this, the problem isn't that they failed to complete the first half. The problem is that they succeeded too well. They built such a convincing persona, achieved such external success, became so identified with their mask that they can't imagine life without it. The thought of letting it crack, of facing what's underneath, terrifies them more than spending another 40 years in the prison they've built. And that's where we are, standing at the threshold, the first half complete, the second half calling, the persona that served us so well becoming the very thing that prevents our next evolution, the ego that protected us for 40 years now needing to surrender its supremacy to something larger, the self. Jung's message was both compassionate and uncompromising. You must complete the first half before you can enter the second. But once the first half is complete, remaining there becomes not just limiting but destructive. The psyche will not allow it. Your soul will not permit you to waste the second half, maintaining the illusions of the first. The call has been issued. At 40, the spirit awakens. The question is, will you answer? Let's address the question you might be asking. Why 40? Why not 30 or 50 or 60? Why does this particular age serve as such a powerful threshold for psychological transformation? Is it arbitrary, cultural, or is there something deeper, something archetypal about this specific life stage? Jung's answer, drawn from decades of clinical observation and his deep study of mythology and religious traditions, is that 40 is not arbitrary. It's an archetypal threshold that appears across cultures and throughout history. It's the age when Moses spent 40 days on Mount Sinai, receiving divine revelation. It's the age when Buddha sat under the Bodhi tree and achieved enlightenment. It's referenced throughout religious texts as the period of testing, transformation, and initiation. 40 years wandering in the desert, 40 days in the wilderness. The number itself carries symbolic weight as the duration of profound change. But Jung wasn't relying on mysticism or numerology. He observed actual psychological patterns, and what he found was that regardless of culture, regardless of era, people around the age of 40, give or take 5 years, experienced a fundamental shift in their relationship to life. The concerns that dominated their 20s and 30s lost urgency. New questions emerged. The psyche began demanding different things. Why? Let's break down the multiple factors that converge around this age to create what Jung called the individuation imperative. First, there's the simple mathematics of mortality. If you live to 80, which is a generous estimate, not a guarantee, then 40 is your midpoint. At 40, you've lived half your life. You have, at best, as many years ahead of you as behind you, and those remaining years will subjectively pass faster than the first 40. Time accelerates as you age. Your 40s feel shorter than your 20s. Your 50s feel shorter than your 30s. The runway is shortening. This mortality awareness isn't intellectual, it's visceral. It hits you when you notice your body changing, the gray hair, the slower recovery from injuries, the reading glasses, the metabolism shift. It hits you when your parents age or die. It hits you when friends start getting serious illnesses. It hits you when you realize that careers you thought you'd pursue someday, adventures you thought you'd have eventually, dreams you thought you'd fulfill later, if you don't start now, you might never start at all. This creates existential pressure. When you're 25 and miserable in your job, you tell yourself you have time to figure it out. When you're 35 and unhappy in your marriage, you tell yourself you'll address it later. But at 45, the later is running out. The luxury of postponing your life, of living inauthentically with the vague promise that someday you'll get around to being yourself, that luxury evaporates. Jung observed that this mortality awareness serves a crucial function. It forces the question of meaning. When time feels infinite, you can waste it. When time becomes finite, every choice matters. How you spend your days is how you spend your life. And if you're spending your days maintaining a persona, performing a role, living someone else's script, those are days of your actual existence you're sacrificing. Days you'll never get back. Second, there's what Jung called the completion of external tasks. By 40, most people have either achieved the goals they set in their 20s or accepted they won't achieve them. You've either climbed your career ladder or acknowledged you're not going to. You've either married and had children or accepted you won't. You've either established financial security or realized you're always going to struggle. You've either earned the respect and recognition you sought or learned to live without it. This completion or failure forces confrontation. If you achieved everything you were supposed to want, why aren't you satisfied? You got the partnership, the house, the family, the status. According to the script, you should be happy, but you're not. You're empty. This creates a crisis. Either the goals themselves were wrong, or you are. And since admitting the goals were wrong means admitting you wasted 40 years chasing illusions, most people's first response is to conclude something's wrong with them. Hence the epidemic of depression among outwardly successful middle-aged people. Conversely, if you failed to achieve what you were supposed to want around 40, you start asking whether you actually wanted those things anyway. The career you didn't attain, would it have satisfied you? The marriage that didn't happen, would it have been authentic? The status you didn't earn, does it actually matter? Sometimes the failure to complete first-half tasks is your psyche's way of protecting you from a life that was never yours to begin with. Either way, success or failure, the external orientation of the first half reaches its natural end. The game is over. The question shifts from how do I win to what was I playing for, and that's when things get interesting. Third, there's the biological dimension. Around 40, your body begins its descent. This isn't opinion, it's physiology. Hormone levels shift. Testosterone decreases in men. Estrogen fluctuates wildly in women approaching menopause. Metabolism slows. Muscle mass decreases. Injuries take longer to heal. The body that once felt invincible starts revealing its mortality. Jung recognized that the psyche is deeply connected to the body. These biological changes aren't just physical, they're psychological. The body's aging process triggers psychological reflection. You can't pretend you're immortal when your body is demonstrably declining. You can't maintain the illusion of infinite time when your physical form is showing clear signs of finite existence. Moreover, Jung observed that these hormonal shifts often correlate with psychological shifts. The decrease in testosterone in men often coincides with a natural softening, a movement toward more receptive, feeling-oriented ways of being, what Jung called the Anima integration. The hormonal chaos women experience approaching menopause often coincides with a surge of assertiveness, independence, and refusal to tolerate what they've tolerated for decades, what Jung called the Animus activation. The body, in other words, is collaborating with the psyche. The biological changes of midlife aren't working against psychological individuation. They're supporting it. Your body is telling you the first half is over. Time to become something different. Fourth, there's what Jung called the return of the repressed. For 40 years, you've been building your persona and suppressing your shadow. Every authentic impulse that didn't fit the mask got pushed down. Every desire that contradicted your role got denied. Every quality that threatened your identity got rejected. All of that material has been accumulating in your unconscious, gaining pressure, waiting for its moment. Around 40, the ego's defenses weaken, whether through the stress of maintaining the persona for so long or through the biological changes we just discussed, or through the existential pressure of mortality awareness. Something gives. The container cracks, and what's been repressed starts flooding back. This often manifests first in dreams. Jung paid enormous attention to dreams, recognizing them as communications from the unconscious, and he observed that around 40, people's dreams often become more vivid, more disturbing, more insistent. The unconscious is trying to get the ego's attention. It's saying, we need to talk about what you've been avoiding for 4 decades. The dreams might be explicitly symbolic, like David's dream of wearing armor too heavy to move, or they might be emotionally intense, dreams of rage, grief, desire, terror that seem disproportionate to your waking life. Or they might involve figures from your past, parents, childhood friends, earlier versions of yourself, representing parts of your psyche that were split off during persona formation. If you ignore the dreams, the unconscious escalates, symptoms intensify, the restlessness becomes unbearable, the depression deepens, physical illnesses manifest, relationship problems erupt, addictions intensify. The psyche will get your attention one way or another. Jung called this the confrontation with the unconscious, and he made clear, you don't get to choose whether it happens. You only get to choose whether you engage with it consciously or let it destroy you unconsciously. Fifth, there's the dimension Jung called the self's demand for recognition. This requires understanding Jung's model of the psyche. The ego, your conscious mind, your sense of I, is actually quite small. It's the tip of the iceberg. Beneath it is the personal unconscious, your repressed material, forgotten memories, shadow qualities. And beneath that is what Jung called the collective unconscious, archetypal patterns shared by all humanity. But encompassing all of this, ego, personal unconscious, collective unconscious, is what Jung called the self. Not your self-concept, but the self with a capital S, the totality of your psyche, the organizing principle of your wholeness, what some traditions call the soul or the true self or the divine spark within. For the first 40 years, the ego is in charge. It has to be. You need a strong ego to navigate the world. But the ego is not meant to be permanent dictator. It's meant to be a servant of the self. And around 40, the self begins asserting its authority. It's been patient, allowing the ego to do its first half work. But now it demands recognition. Now it insists on being heard. This self-recognition often comes through what Jung called numinous experiences, moments of direct encounter with something larger than ego. These might be mystical experiences, profound synchronicities, encounters with death that shift your entire worldview, or simply moments of clarity where you see your life from outside the ego's narrow perspective and recognize how small and false your identity has been. The self's demand for recognition is not gentle, it's fierce. It's what creates the sensation that many people describe at 40. I can't keep living like this. Something has to change. I don't know what, But this life, the life I'm currently living, is no longer tolerable. That's not depression. That's the self saying, enough. The false self has run the show long enough. Time for the true self to finally live. All of these factors, mortality awareness, completion of external tasks, biological shifts, return of the repressed, and the self's demand for recognition, converge around 40. Not precisely at 40 for everyone. For some, it's 37. For others, it's 44. But within a relatively narrow window, these forces reach critical mass. And that's when the awakening begins. That's when life stops feeling like something you're managing from a distance and starts feeling like something you're living from the inside. That's when the persona cracks and your authentic self starts emerging. That's when you finally begin the real work of your existence, becoming who you actually are. So if you're approaching 40 and feeling restless, anxious, depressed, or strangely excited, pay attention. If you're in your 40s and experiencing the symptoms we've been describing, don't pathologize it. If you're past 40 and wondering why you didn't experience this transformation, ask yourself what defenses you've erected to avoid it. The 40-year threshold isn't arbitrary, it's archetypal, it's developmental. It's the moment when life moves from the morning phase to the afternoon phase, from building outward to exploring inward, from performing to being. And it's the moment when your soul finally, forcefully demands that you stop abandoning yourself and start living your actual life. Jung said it clearly, the afternoon of human life must also have a significance of its own and cannot be merely a pitiful appendage to life's morning. At 40, that afternoon begins. The question is, will you greet it consciously or resist it until it destroys you? Before we continue, I want to pause and ask you to reflect. How old are you right now? And if you're around this 40-year threshold, whether approaching it, in the midst of it, or past it, do you recognize these patterns in your own life? Comment your age and whether you've felt this turning point, or if you're anticipating or dreading it. This isn't just theory. This is your life we're talking about. And your willingness to consciously engage with this transformation will determine whether your second half is authentic liberation or extended performance. Choose wisely. Now we come to one of Jung's most crucial and most misunderstood concepts, the shadow. And I need you to understand this not as abstract psychology, but as the living, breathing reality that's probably operating in your life right now, whether you're aware of it or not. The shadow is everything you are but cannot admit you are. It's the repository of all the qualities, impulses, desires, and potentials that you had to exile from your conscious identity in order to build your persona. For 40 years, you've been maintaining a version of yourself that gains approval, achieves success, and navigates social expectations. And in order to maintain that version, you've had to systematically reject, deny, and repress everything that doesn't fit. Let me be very specific. If your persona is the nice person, your shadow contains your cruelty, your selfishness, your capacity for vindictive rage. If your persona is the strong one, your shadow contains your vulnerability, your neediness, your desperate longing to be taken care of. If your persona is the rational intellectual, your shadow contains your superstitions, your mystical longings, your non-logical ways of knowing. If your persona is the responsible adult, your shadow contains your irresponsibility, your desire to abandon all obligations, your wish to be completely free of others' expectations. The shadow isn't just negative qualities, though. This is crucial. Your shadow also contains positive potentials that you rejected because they didn't fit your assigned role. If you were raised to be practical and you suppressed your artistic gifts, that creativity lives in your shadow. If you were taught to be submissive and you buried your natural authority, that power lives in your shadow. If you learned to be serious and you killed your playfulness, that joy lives in your shadow. Jung insisted, everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. The more you deny your shadow, the more powerful it becomes. The more you insist you don't have certain qualities, the more those qualities control you from the unconscious. The more you claim, I'm not that kind of person, the more you're setting yourself up for the shadow to erupt in exactly that way. And around 40, erupt it does. Why 40? Because that's when the container can no longer hold the pressure. For 40 years, you've been stuffing material into your shadow, every authentic impulse rejected, every real desire denied, every genuine feeling suppressed. The shadow grows denser and denser, more and more charged with psychic energy, and at a certain point the ego's defenses can't contain it anymore. Think of it like a pressure cooker. For the first half of life, you keep cranking up the heat. More responsibilities, more expectations, more persona maintenance, while keeping the lid tightly sealed. Eventually, something has to give. Either you consciously release the pressure by doing shadow work, or the pressure releases itself explosively in ways you don't control. Let me show you what shadow eruption looks like in practice. The most common manifestation is the affair. And I'm not talking about conscious, mutually agreed upon open relationships. I'm talking about the 45-year-old married man who suddenly becomes obsessed with a coworker, 20 years his junior. The 42-year-old devoted wife who finds herself in a passionate, reckless affair with someone completely inappropriate. From the outside, it looks like midlife crisis cliché. From the inside, it feels like finally coming alive after decades of deadness. What's actually happening? The shadow is seeking life. If your persona has been the responsible spouse for 20 years, dutifully maintaining the marriage, suppressing desire, killing spontaneity, being predictable and safe, your shadow contains all the aliveness you sacrificed. The affair isn't really about the other person. It's your shadow's desperate attempt to experience vitality, passion, wildness, unpredictability. It's life force that's been dammed up for decades suddenly breaking through. Jung would ask, what if, instead of acting out the shadow through an affair, you consciously integrated what the shadow is seeking? What if you brought more aliveness, passion, and authenticity into your existing relationship? What if you stopped being so controlled and allowed yourself to be spontaneous? What if the problem isn't that you need a new partner, but that you need to stop abandoning yourself in partnership? But most people don't do that work. They let the shadow erupt unconsciously, destroy their marriage, chase the projection, and discover a few years later that they've just created the same deadness with a new person because they never integrated what they were actually seeking. Another common shadow eruption: radical career changes. The successful attorney who quits to become a yoga instructor, the corporate executive who abandons everything to write poetry, the doctor who walks away from their practice to open a bakery. Sometimes these changes are genuine callings, like David's story we discussed earlier, but often they're shadow eruptions disguised as authentic transformation. How do you tell the difference? Real individuation involves integration, not just rejection. If you're fleeing your career because you hate who you've become, but you haven't done any internal work to understand why you chose that career in the first place, or what parts of yourself you've been denying, you're not individuating. You're letting your shadow run the show. You'll just create a new persona, the spiritual seeker, the creative bohemian, the simple life advocate, and suppress a different set of qualities. Real transformation asks, what aspects of myself did I have to kill to succeed in my career? Can I reclaim those aspects while still honoring the genuine competence and skills I've developed? Can I integrate rather than just reject? Shadow eruption also manifests through projection. This is crucial to understand. Projection is when you see in others what you cannot see in yourself. The qualities you've most strongly rejected end up getting projected outward, and you see them everywhere, usually with strong emotional reaction. If you've suppressed your anger and built a persona of endless patience, you'll be surrounded by angry people who trigger you constantly. If you've denied your neediness and built a persona of total self-sufficiency, you'll attract clingy, dependent people who disgust you. If you've rejected your selfishness and built a persona of pure selflessness, you'll be enraged by selfish people everywhere you look. Jung's principle. What you judge most harshly in others is what you've most strongly denied in yourself. Your strongest reactions reveal your shadow. The person who can't stop talking about how lazy people are, suppressed their own need for rest. The person who's obsessed with others' dishonesty, hiding their own deceptions. The person who's constantly criticizing others' weakness, terrified of their own vulnerability. Around 40, these projections intensify. You become increasingly bothered by people who embody what you've rejected. Your judgment becomes harsher, your intolerance grows, and you have no idea you're looking in a mirror. The shadow also erupts through addiction. I'm using addiction broadly here, not just substances, but any compulsive behavior used to avoid feeling. Alcohol, drugs, pornography, gambling, shopping, eating, work, exercise, social media, gaming. The specific addiction varies, but the function is the same, numbing the pain of unlived life. Jung recognized that addiction often represents spiritual hunger, misdirected toward material solutions. The addict is seeking transcendence, seeking to escape the prison of ego and persona, seeking some experience beyond their deadened daily existence. But instead of doing the conscious work of shadow integration and genuine individuation, they're using substances or behaviors to temporarily escape. Around 40, addictions often intensify or relapse after years of sobriety. Why? Because the pressure of the unlived life becomes unbearable. The shadow is demanding recognition, and if you won't face it consciously, you'll medicate it. The recovering alcoholic who's been sober for 15 years suddenly relapses at 43. The person who hasn't struggled with eating disorders since their 20s suddenly finds themselves binging and purging at 41. The shadow will not be denied. It will find expression one way or another. Then there's the shadow eruption through illness. Jung was clear. The psyche and soma are one. What you refuse to face psychologically will eventually manifest somatically. The body keeps the score, and around 40, when the shadow pressure reaches its peak, physical symptoms often appear. This isn't New Age wishful thinking. This is well-documented psychosomatic reality. The driven executive who never lets himself rest gets his body's message through a heart attack at 46. The selfless mother who never expresses anger develops autoimmune disease at 42, her suppressed rage literally turning her body against itself. The person who spent decades suppressing grief gets diagnosed with cancer, and when they finally allow themselves to feel, they discover decades of unfelt pain. I'm not saying all illness is psychological, but Jung insisted we must ask, what is this symptom trying to tell me? What have I been refusing to acknowledge? What part of myself am I killing that's now killing me back? So what do you do with all this? How do you work with your shadow instead of letting it destroy you? Jung developed specific practices, and I want to give you a framework you can actually use. The shadow mapping exercise. First, identify your persona. Write down the identity you've been maintaining. Who are you to the world? What qualities do you most pride yourself on? What would people say about you at your funeral right now? That's your persona, the mask you've perfected. Second, flip it. For every quality your persona claims, identify its opposite. If your persona is kind, the opposite is cruel. If it's strong, the opposite is weak. If it's responsible, the opposite is irresponsible. Don't judge these opposites, just identify them. Third, ask where in my life is the opposite quality secretly operating. This requires brutal honesty. You think you're kind, but where are you cruel? Maybe not obviously, but subtly, through passive aggression, through neglect, through judgment disguised as concern. You think you're strong, but where are you weak? Maybe not physically, but emotionally, collapsing privately while performing strength publicly. You think you're responsible, but where are you secretly irresponsible? Maybe financially, maybe relationally, maybe toward your own needs. Fourth, explore your triggers. Who makes you irrationally angry? What qualities in others disgust you most? What do you judge most harshly? Write these down. Now ask the hard question, where in myself do these qualities exist? Not intellectually, I guess everyone has some anger, but specifically, where am I the thing I'm judging? Fifth, work with your dreams. Start keeping a dream journal. Jung believed dreams are the primary way the unconscious communicates with consciousness. Pay attention to figures in your dreams, especially those that disturb you, the angry father, the seductive stranger, the frightening monster, the helpless child. These aren't just random images, they're parts of your psyche, often shadow aspects trying to get your attention. Sixth, practice active imagination. This is a Jung technique where you dialogue with parts of yourself. When you notice a strong emotional reaction, don't just dismiss it. Sit with it, personify it, give it a voice, ask it questions. What do you want? What are you trying to tell me? What part of me have I been denying that you represent? This sounds strange if you've never done it, but it's remarkably effective for bringing shadow material into consciousness. Seventh, make amends for your projections. Once you recognize you've been projecting your shadow onto someone, seeing in them what you can't see in yourself, you have two responsibilities. First, withdraw the projection. See them as they actually are, not as a screen for your disowned qualities. Second, own what you've projected. Acknowledge in yourself the qualities you were seeing in them. But here's the crucial warning. Shadow work isn't about becoming better. It's about becoming more whole. Jung never said, integrate your shadow so you can be a better person. He said, integrate your shadow so you can be a real person. A whole person contains darkness and light, selfishness and generosity, cruelty and kindness, strength and vulnerability. The goal isn't perfection, it's completeness. When you successfully integrate shadow material, you don't eliminate the quality. You bring it into consciousness where you can choose when and how to express it. The integrated shadow doesn't disappear. It becomes available. You don't stop being capable of anger. You become able to use anger consciously and appropriately. You don't stop being capable of selfishness. You become able to prioritize your needs when necessary, without guilt or shame. This is what Jung meant when he said, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The shadow work of the 40-year threshold isn't about becoming a perfect enlightened being. It's about becoming human, fully, completely, authentically human. And that means embracing all of it, the light and the dark, the noble and the base, the beautiful and the ugly. At 40, when your shadow erupts, you have a choice. You can let it destroy you unconsciously through affairs, addictions, illness, projections, destructive behaviors, or you can meet it consciously, integrate it deliberately, and allow it to make you whole rather than fragmenting you further. The eruption is coming whether you're ready or not. The only question is, will you be conscious for it? Let me tell you about Sarah, because while David's story illustrated how the persona shatters for men, Sarah's story shows something equally important, how the awakening manifests differently for women, particularly women who've lived their entire lives within rigid religious and cultural scripts. Sarah was 39 years old. On the surface, she appeared to be living the blessed life, married for 18 years to Michael, a pastor at a large evangelical church in suburban Texas. 3 children, ages 16, 13, and 9. Sarah homeschooled all of them, as was expected in her community. She led the women's ministry at church. She organized potlucks and Bible studies. She was everything a pastor's wife was supposed to be. Modest, gracious, endlessly serving, always smiling. Sarah's Facebook page looked like a testament to faithful living. Photos of family dinners around a large table, scripture verses overlaid on sunset images, updates about her children's accomplishments. Other women in her community looked at Sarah with envy and admiration. She had it all figured out. She was the model of Christian womanhood, except Sarah was disappearing. That's how she later described it. I was slowly dissolving, like I was becoming less and less real with each passing day. It started with small, unsettling experiences. Sarah would be standing at the kitchen sink, washing dishes, something she'd done thousands of times, and suddenly she wouldn't recognize her own hands. She'd look at them moving through the soapy water, and they seemed like someone else's hands, like she was watching a stranger's life from somewhere far away. Or she'd be at church, sitting in the front row as the pastor's wife always did, and she'd have the uncanny sensation that she was an actress in a movie, like she was playing a role called faithful wife, but the real Sarah was somewhere else entirely, watching this performance with growing horror. Her husband noticed her distraction. "You seem distant lately," he'd say. "Is everything okay?" And Sarah would smile, that automatic smile she'd perfected over 18 years, and say, "I'm fine, just tired." Because what else could she say? How could she explain that she felt like she was dying inside, that her own life felt like a suffocating costume she couldn't remove? Then the dreams started, the first dream that shook her. Sarah was in the church sanctuary, but it was on fire. Flames engulfing everything, the pews, the altar, the cross. And instead of being horrified, Sarah felt relief. She stood in the center watching it burn, and she was smiling. When she woke up, she was confused and disturbed. Why would she dream of her church burning? She was a faithful believer. This made no sense. The dreams intensified. In one, Sarah was running, naked through a thunderstorm, dancing wildly, completely free. In another, she was arguing with her father, who'd been dead for 5 years, screaming at him with rage she'd never allowed herself to feel. In another, she was making love to a woman, and the dream was so vivid, so powerfully erotic that she woke up gasping. That last dream terrified her most of all. Sarah had been taught her entire life that homosexuality was sin, that such desires were demonic temptation. She'd never allowed herself to even consider that she might be attracted to women. That was impossible. She was married. She was a mother. She was a Christian. People like her didn't have such thoughts. But once that dream cracked something open, memories started flooding back. Memories she'd successfully suppressed for 25 years. Her intense friendship with her college roommate Jessica, the way her heart raced when Jessica touched her arm, the devastation when Jessica graduated and moved away, the way she'd channeled all that emotional intensity into her relationship with Michael because he was safe, because he was appropriate, because marrying him was what good Christian girls did. Sarah began having dissociative episodes with increasing frequency. She'd be driving and suddenly couldn't remember where she was going. She'd be talking to her children and her voice would sound like it was coming from somewhere outside her body. She'd be leading a women's Bible study and have the overwhelming urge to stand up and scream, "This is all bullshit," and then feel immediate shame for having such a thought. Her body started rebelling too. Migraines that came without warning, panic attacks that left her gasping for breath, insomnia so severe she'd go days with only a few hours of sleep. Her doctor ran tests. Everything came back normal. He suggested antidepressants. She took them for a month, but they just made her feel more numb, more distant, more like she was watching her life through thick glass. Around this time, Sarah stumbled across something online, an article about Carl Jung and the concept of the shadow. She'd never heard of Jung. Her religious community was suspicious of psychology, viewing it as secular humanism that denied biblical truth. But alone in her bedroom at 3 in the morning, unable to sleep, Sarah read this article about how we construct personas to gain approval and suppress everything that doesn't fit, about how the unlived life eventually demands recognition, about how the psyche will not allow you to betray yourself forever. Sarah began crying, deep, wrenching sobs that she had to muffle with a pillow so she wouldn't wake Michael, because she recognized herself completely. The persona of perfect pastor's wife that she'd been maintaining for 18 years wasn't her. It had never been her. It was a character she'd constructed to please her father, to please her husband, to please her church community, to please the God she'd been taught about since childhood. But who was the real Sarah? The one beneath the mask? Sarah had no idea. She'd never been allowed to find out. Here's what Sarah had learned to suppress over 40 years of perfect Christian girlhood. She was intellectually curious in ways her community deemed dangerous. She wanted to read books on her church's banned list. She had questions about biblical literalism that she'd never been allowed to voice. She found other religions fascinating rather than threatening. Her mind was naturally skeptical, analytical, hungry for knowledge beyond what was deemed acceptable. She was artistically gifted in ways that had been redirected toward appropriate expression. As a teenager, she'd loved to paint, wild, abstract pieces full of color and emotion. Her father had told her that was prideful self-expression and she should instead use her gifts to make bulletin boards for Sunday school. She'd buried the artist in herself so completely that she'd forgotten she'd ever wanted to create. She was angry, deeply, righteously angry, at her father who'd controlled every aspect of her childhood, at her church that told her women were to be submissive and silent, at her husband who expected her to manage every domestic detail while he pursued his calling, at herself for complying for so long, but anger wasn't allowed. Christian women were supposed to be gentle, long-suffering, always kind. So Sarah had buried her rage for 4 decades, and now it was eating her alive from the inside. She was sexually complex in ways that didn't fit the heteronormative script. The dream about the woman wasn't an aberration, it was her psyche telling her the truth. Sarah was bisexual. She'd always been attracted to women, but she'd so successfully repressed this that she'd convinced herself those feelings were just intense friendship or admiration. The persona couldn't contain bisexuality, so bisexuality was exiled to the shadow. And perhaps most fundamentally, Sarah had spiritual experiences that didn't fit her religion's framework. She'd had moments of mystical awareness, feeling connected to something vast and sacred while watching a sunset, experiencing what she could only describe as divine presence while alone in nature. But her church taught that such experiences were either fraudulent or demonic if they occurred outside prescribed forms. So Sarah had learned to distrust her own spiritual experiences, to only accept ones that fit the acceptable template. All of this, the intellectual curiosity, the artistic impulse, the rage, the sexual authenticity, the mystical experiences, had been systematically suppressed to maintain the persona of perfect Christian wife and mother. And at 39, her psyche was staging a full-scale rebellion. The breaking point came on a Sunday morning. Sarah was at church, as always, sitting in her designated seat. Michael was preaching about the importance of traditional family values, about how society's moral decay came from people following their own desires instead of God's commands. And as Sarah sat there listening to her husband condemn everything she was secretly feeling and experiencing, something inside her snapped. It wasn't a gradual crack. It was instant, complete fracture. Sarah stood up in the middle of the sermon, hundreds of people watching, and walked out. Just walked out, down the aisle, out the door, into the parking lot. She got in her car and drove. She didn't know where she was going. She just drove. She ended up at a park 40 miles away, sitting by a lake, and for the first time in her adult life, she asked herself the question she'd never been allowed to ask. What do I actually want? Not what I'm supposed to want. Not what will make others happy. What do I, Sarah, actually want from my life? And the answer that came back terrified her. I want to stop pretending. I want to stop performing. I want to discover who I actually am beneath all these layers of who I was supposed to be, even if it costs me everything. What followed was what Jung would recognize as the necessary destruction before reconstruction. Sarah told Michael she needed time alone to think. He was confused, then angry, then accusatory. You're being selfish. You're abandoning your family. This isn't like you. And Sarah realized he was right. This wasn't like the persona he'd married. This was the real Sarah finally refusing to stay buried. She moved into an apartment. Just for a few months, she told herself at first. She needed space to think. But as the weeks passed, Sarah realized she couldn't go back. Not to the marriage built on a false identity, not to the church that required her silence and submission, not to the life that demanded she sacrifice her authenticity for others' comfort. The cost was devastating. Michael filed for divorce, citing abandonment. The church community that had celebrated her for 18 years turned on her completely. Women she'd considered close friends stopped speaking to her. Her own mother told her she was destroying her children's lives. The judgment was fierce and unanimous. Sarah was selfish, sinful, having a mental breakdown, possibly demon-possessed. But Sarah continued the work. She found a Jungian analyst, a woman who understood what was happening, not as pathology, but as emergence. They worked with Sarah's dreams, which became increasingly vivid as she paid attention to them. They traced the patterns of her persona formation, seeing clearly how every major life decision had been made to comply with external expectations rather than internal knowing. Sarah had to grieve, deeply. She grieved the 18 years she'd spent in a marriage that was never authentic. She grieved the childhood she'd never had because she'd been performing righteousness from age 5. She grieved the art she never made, the books she never read, the questions she never asked, the experiences she never had because they didn't fit the script. But alongside the grief came something else. Aliveness. For the first time in 40 years, Sarah felt real. Sitting alone in her small apartment, eating cereal for dinner, rejected by everyone she'd known. She felt more authentically herself than she ever had in her beautiful home, surrounded by family and community. She started painting again, wild, colorful, emotionally intense pieces that expressed everything she'd suppressed. She started reading voraciously: psychology, philosophy, comparative religion, feminist theology. She started therapy to process her sexuality, eventually coming out as bisexual and beginning to date women. She found a progressive spiritual community that welcomed questions rather than demanding certainty. 3 years after her awakening, Sarah was living a completely different life. She worked at a nonprofit supporting LGBTQ youth from conservative religious backgrounds, helping others navigate the journey she'd made. She'd gone back to school for a degree in art therapy. She had a small circle of authentic friends who knew the real her. Her relationship with her children was complicated. They were angry about the divorce, confused by her transformation, but slowly healing as they saw their mother becoming genuine rather than performing perfection. When asked if she regretted the breakdown that destroyed her life, Sarah said, "It didn't destroy my life. It destroyed my lie. My actual life began at 39 when I finally stopped performing and started being. This is what Jung meant when he talked about the individuation process. It's not comfortable, it's not easy. It costs you everything the false self built. For Sarah, it cost her marriage, her community, her reputation, her financial security, her relationship with her family of origin. It cost her the identity she'd maintained for 4 decades. But what she gained was herself, her actual self. The Sarah who'd been buried alive at age 5 when she first learned that being herself wasn't acceptable. The Sarah who had to die so the perfect Christian daughter could live. That Sarah, creative, questioning, angry, bisexual, mystical, authentic, finally got to exist. Sarah's story illustrates something crucial about the 40-year transformation for women specifically. In patriarchal cultures, including many religious communities, women are often required to construct personas of selfless service, endless availability, and submission to male authority. The persona of good woman demands the sacrifice of authentic desire, personal authority, and self-determination. Jung recognized this. He talked about how women in the first half of life often overdevelop their relational, nurturing, receptive qualities, what he associated with the feminine, while suppressing their assertive, independent, intellectual qualities, what he associated with the masculine or animus. Then around 40, the animus, the suppressed masculine aspect, demands integration. This doesn't mean women become masculine. It means they reclaim the parts of themselves that were deemed unacceptable, their anger, their ambition, their sexuality, their authority, their right to prioritize their own needs. The nice woman becomes fierce. The submissive wife becomes demanding. The selfless mother becomes boundaried. Not because they're broken, but because they're finally becoming whole. Sarah's rebellion was sacred, not because it felt good or was easy, but because it was necessary. Her psyche would not allow her to spend another 40 years maintaining a false identity. The dissociation, the dreams, the panic attacks, these weren't symptoms of illness. They were symptoms of health. Her soul screaming, "Stop abandoning me. I will not tolerate another day of this betrayal." And when Sarah finally listened, when she walked out of that church, out of that marriage, out of that entire constructed life, she wasn't destroying her existence. She was claiming it for the first time. This is the pattern Jung saw again and again. The awakening at 40 isn't a crisis to be managed. It's a calling to be answered. And for women especially, that calling often requires rebellion against every expectation, every role, every should they've internalized from a culture that wants them compliant, selfless, and silent. Sarah's transformation asks each of us, what version of myself have I been performing to gain acceptance? What authentic desires have I suppressed to maintain my persona? What would it cost me to finally stop pretending? And more importantly, what will it cost me if I don't? Because here's the truth Sarah discovered. You can maintain the persona until you die. You can keep performing, keep pleasing, keep sacrificing yourself on the altar of others' comfort, but you'll die having never lived your actual life. You'll die and the last thought you'll have is, I never got to be myself. Or you can do what Sarah did. Answer the call, face the devastation, lose everything the false self built, and finally discover who you actually are beneath 40 years of performance. Jung would say, the choice is yours, but the cost of not choosing, the cost of remaining asleep, is everything that matters. Your soul, your authenticity, your one precious, unrepeatable life. We've talked about the persona and the shadow. Now we need to explore one of Jung's most sophisticated and often misunderstood concepts, the anima and animus, because understanding this aspect of the psyche is crucial for comprehending what happens at 40, particularly the often confusing and disorienting changes in how men and women experience themselves and their relationships. Here's the foundation. Jung observed that human beings are not psychologically monogendered. Regardless of your biological sex or gender identity, your psyche contains both masculine and feminine elements. For Jung, these weren't primarily about social roles or stereotypes, though culture certainly shapes how they manifest. They were about fundamental psychological patterns, ways of being and relating that exist in all humans, but get developed unequally depending on what your persona requires. Let me be very clear before we go further. Jung's language around masculine and feminine can feel dated or essentialist to contemporary ears, and there are valid critiques of how he formulated these concepts. But the underlying insight remains profound. There are aspects of your psyche that you've overdeveloped and aspects you've underdeveloped. And around 40, the underdeveloped aspects demand integration. Jung used the terms anima to describe a man's inner feminine aspect and animus to describe a woman's inner masculine aspect. In the first half of life, most people develop the qualities that align with their assigned gender role, while suppressing the qualities associated with the opposite gender. Then, around 40, the suppressed contrasexual aspect erupts and demands recognition. Let's start with men and the anima. In traditional masculine socialization, men are taught to develop certain qualities: rational thinking, physical strength, emotional control, independence, assertiveness, goal orientation, competitive drive. These become the foundation of their persona. Meanwhile, qualities coded as feminine get systematically suppressed. Emotional sensitivity, intuition, receptivity, nurturing capacity, aesthetic appreciation, relational attunement, vulnerability. For the first 40 years, this works. The man develops his masculine persona, becomes the provider, the achiever, the strong one, the rational one. He's successful in his career. He's capable, he's respected, but all those suppressed feminine qualities don't disappear. They get pushed into the unconscious, where they form what Jung called the anima, the soul image, the inner feminine. Then, around 40, something shifts. The driven executive suddenly wants to paint. The aggressive businessman becomes interested in poetry. The stoic father starts crying at movies. The rational scientist has mystical experiences he can't explain. The competitive athlete discovers gardening and finds it more satisfying than winning. The emotionally controlled man starts having feelings that overwhelm him. What's happening? The anima is waking up. All those suppressed feminine qualities, feeling, intuition, receptivity, creativity, relationship, are demanding integration. The psyche is insisting. You've spent 40 years developing your masculine side. Now it's time to develop the feminine. Not instead of the masculine, but alongside it. Not replacing one with the other, but becoming whole. This integration terrifies many men because it feels like loss of identity. If I become more emotional, more receptive, more focused on relationships instead of achievements, am I still a man? The question reveals the problem. They've confused their persona, the masculine mask, with their essential identity. Integrating the anima doesn't make you less masculine. It makes you more human, more complete, more capable of the full range of human experience. Jung observed that men who resist anima integration become rigid and brittle in the second half of life. They double down on the masculine persona, becoming more aggressive, more controlling, more obsessed with power and status. But this rigidity is a defense against the inner feminine that terrifies them, and the anima, rejected and suppressed, becomes increasingly negative and destructive, manifesting as depression, rage, addiction, or destructive relationships. Conversely, men who successfully integrate their anima in the second half become more themselves. They don't become feminine in persona, they remain men, but they become men who can feel deeply, who value relationships as much as achievements, who create beauty, who access intuition, who allow themselves to be receptive and vulnerable. They become whole rather than one-dimensional. Now let's look at women and the animus. In traditional feminine socialization, women are taught to develop emotional attunement, nurturing capacity, relational skills, aesthetic sensitivity, receptivity, flexibility, collaborative rather than competitive orientation. These become the foundation of their persona. Meanwhile, qualities coded as masculine get systematically suppressed. Assertiveness, intellectual authority, independence, ambition, anger, boundary setting, self-prioritization. For the first 40 years, this works. The woman develops her feminine persona, becomes the caretaker, the emotional center of relationships, the one who manages everyone else's needs. She's loved, she's needed, she's valued for her service, but all those suppressed masculine qualities don't disappear. They get pushed into the unconscious, where they form the animus, the inner masculine. Then around 40, something shifts. And this shift is often more dramatic for women than for men, because patriarchal cultures require women to suppress so much more of themselves. The devoted wife suddenly refuses to tolerate disrespect. The selfless mother starts prioritizing her own needs. The agreeable woman becomes fiercely opinionated. The emotionally attuned caretaker starts setting hard boundaries. The collaborative team player becomes competitive and ambitious. The woman who never expressed anger becomes someone you don't want to cross. This is the animus integration. All those suppressed masculine qualities, assertion, authority, independence, ambition, healthy selfishness, anger, are demanding recognition. The psyche is insisting, you've spent 40 years taking care of everyone else. Now it's time to take care of yourself. You've spent 40 years being nice. Now it's time to be real. You've spent 40 years suppressing your authority. Now it's time to claim it. Sarah's story from the previous chapter is a perfect illustration. For 39 years, she'd overdeveloped her feminine qualities, nurturing, selfless, emotionally available, endlessly serving, while completely suppressing her masculine aspects. Then her animus erupted. The assertion to walk out of church, the authority to question religious teachings, the independence to leave her marriage, the ambition to pursue her own education and career, the healthy selfishness to prioritize her own authenticity. Jung observed that women who resist animus integration in the second half become increasingly bitter and resentful. They continue performing selfless service while seething with unexpressed anger. They remain in relationships where they're undervalued, becoming passive-aggressive and martyred. Their suppressed animus turns toxic, manifesting as cutting criticism, rigid opinions, or identification with external male authority figures who carry their disowned power. Conversely, women who successfully integrate their animus become formidable in the best sense. They don't become masculine in persona, they remain women. But they become women who can assert themselves, who claim intellectual authority, who set boundaries, who pursue their own goals, who express anger appropriately, who refuse to sacrifice themselves for others' comfort. They become whole rather than half-formed. Here's what's crucial to understand. Anima-animus integration doesn't mean becoming androgynous or gender-neutral. It means becoming psychologically complete. A man integrating his anima remains masculine, but becomes a man who's developed his feeling function, his aesthetic sense, his capacity for intimacy. A woman integrating her animus remains feminine, but becomes a woman who's developed her assertion, her authority, her independence. This integration also profoundly changes relationships. Many marriages don't survive the 40-year threshold precisely because they were built on complementary personas rather than whole individuals. He was the strong, rational provider. She was the emotional nurturing caretaker. This complementarity creates a functional system, but not authentic intimacy. Then at 40, he starts integrating his anima, becoming more emotional, more interested in relationships, less focused on achievement. And she starts integrating her animus, becoming more assertive, more focused on her own goals, less available for endless caretaking. The complementary system collapses. Each person is becoming more whole, but the relationship that was built on their incompleteness can't adapt. Some couples navigate this successfully. They recognize that both partners are individuating, and they support each other's transformation. The relationship deepens because now you have two whole people relating authentically rather than two half people playing complementary roles. But this requires both partners to be willing to evolve, which is rare. More commonly, one partner individuates and the other resists. He starts crying and wanting to talk about feelings, and she's disgusted by his weakness because she married the strong, stoic man. Or she starts setting boundaries and pursuing her own interests, and he's threatened by her selfishness because he married the selfless caretaker. The partner who resists the other's transformation is usually the one who's terrified of their own. Jung was clear. Anima-Animus integration is not optional if you want to individuate. You cannot become whole while maintaining a one-sided development. The man who remains purely masculine and the woman who remains purely feminine are both psychologically incomplete. They're operating at half capacity, using half their potential, living half a life. So how do you actually integrate your contrasexual aspect? Let me give you practical guidance. For men integrating the anima, first, develop your feeling function. This doesn't mean becoming emotional for the sake of it. It means learning to actually feel your feelings rather than intellectualizing them, suppressing them, or acting them out. When something affects you, can you sit with the feeling? Can you name it? Can you express it without shame? Second, value relationships for their own sake, not because they're useful, not because they serve your goals, but because connection itself matters. Can you be present with someone without an agenda? Can you prioritize relationship over achievement? Third, cultivate aesthetic appreciation. Engage with beauty, art, music, nature, not analytically but receptively. Let yourself be moved. Let yourself appreciate without needing to understand or critique. Fourth, develop your intuition. Learn to trust your gut, your hunches, your non-rational ways of knowing. The anima speaks through images, feelings, hunches. If you only trust logic and data, you're cutting yourself off from half your intelligence. Fifth, practice receptivity. You don't always have to be doing, achieving, controlling. Can you receive? Can you let someone care for you? Can you be vulnerable without experiencing it as weakness? For women integrating the animus, first, develop your assertion. Practice saying no. Practice stating what you want directly. Practice taking up space without apologizing. Your needs matter as much as anyone else's. Your voice deserves to be heard. Second, claim intellectual authority. You don't need to defer to male expertise or couch your intelligence in qualifiers and apologies. You know things. Trust your knowledge. Speak with authority. Third, pursue your own goals. Not in service to others, not because it makes you useful, but because you want them. What do you want to achieve? What ambitions have you suppressed? Give yourself permission to be ambitious. Fourth, express anger appropriately. Anger is not unspiritual or unfeminine. It's information. It tells you when your boundaries are violated, when you're being treated unjustly. Stop performing endless patience. Let yourself be angry when anger is the appropriate response. Fifth, develop independence. You are a whole person, not half of a couple or an extension of your children. Can you be alone without feeling incomplete? Can you make decisions without needing consensus? Can you prioritize yourself without guilt? The Anima-Animus integration fundamentally changes who you are. Men who integrate their anima become more emotionally alive, more relationally attuned, more capable of intimacy. Women who integrate their animus become more self-directed, more powerful in their own right, more capable of independence, and both become more interesting, more complex, more fully human. Jung said, "The meeting with oneself is, at first, the meeting with one's own shadow. The shadow is a tight passage, a narrow door, whose painful constriction no one is spared who goes down to the deep well." Anima-Animus integration is part of this journey. It's meeting the aspects of yourself that your persona required you to reject. It's becoming whole rather than socially acceptable. At 40, these contrasexual aspects wake up and demand recognition. The question is, will you integrate them consciously, allowing them to enrich and complete you? Or will you resist them, forcing them to erupt unconsciously through symptoms, crises, and destructive behaviors? The choice determines whether your second half is expansion or continued limitation, whether you finally become whole or remain fractured until you die. Now that we understand the forces at play, the persona prison, the shadow eruption, the anima-animus awakening, we need a practical roadmap. Because knowing that transformation is happening and knowing how to navigate it consciously are two very different things. Jung spent decades mapping the individuation process, and what he discovered was that it follows predictable stages. Not everyone moves through them at the same pace, and some people get stuck at certain points, but the pattern is archetypal. I'm going to give you Jung's 7-stage map of midlife individuation. This isn't theory. This is based on what Jung observed in hundreds of patients, in his own harrowing journey, and in the myths and religious traditions he studied for his entire life. If you're going through this transformation right now, you'll recognize exactly where you are. If you're approaching it, you'll know what's coming. If you're past it, you'll understand what happened. The journey begins with what Joseph Campbell, building on Jung's work, called the call to adventure. But in the context of midlife individuation, it's more accurately the call to consciousness. And it comes through symptoms. The symptoms vary, but they all share a common quality. They make your current life untenable. You can't continue as you have been. Something fundamental must change. For some people, the call comes as depression, not sadness about something specific, but a pervasive emptiness, a sense that life has lost meaning even though externally everything is fine. You go through the motions, work, family, social, obligations, but you feel dead inside. The activities that once engaged you now feel pointless. The goals that once motivated you now seem hollow. You wake up each morning and think, is this all there is? Another 40 years of this? For others, the call comes as restlessness, an inability to settle, a feeling that you need to be somewhere else, doing something else, being someone else. You start fantasizing about radical changes, quitting your job, moving to another country, leaving your marriage. Not because anything is specifically wrong, but because everything feels wrong, like you're in the wrong life entirely. For others, the call comes as anxiety, panic attacks, racing thoughts, obsessive worries that therapy and medication don't touch. The anxiety isn't really about the surface concerns, work stress, health issues, financial problems. It's existential anxiety, the psyche's alarm system saying you're living a lie and time is running out. For others, the call comes through physical symptoms, chronic pain, autoimmune conditions, digestive issues, mysterious illnesses that doctors can't fully explain. The body is speaking what you won't let yourself know consciously. This life is killing you, and for many people, the call comes through dreams. This was huge for Jung. He paid enormous attention to dreams because he understood them as direct communications from the unconscious. Around 40, dreams often become more vivid, more disturbing, more insistent. You dream of being trapped, suffocating, unable to move. You dream of structures collapsing, fires destroying everything familiar. You dream of versions of yourself from the past appearing and asking why you abandoned them. The key to recognizing stage 1 is this. The symptoms don't respond to conventional solutions. You try antidepressants, but the emptiness remains. You try therapy, but talking about surface issues doesn't touch the core problem. You try changing external circumstances, new job, new relationship, new city, but the restlessness follows you. Because the problem isn't external, it's internal. Your psyche is calling you to transformation, and nothing else will satisfy it. Jung said this explicitly. The symptoms are not the problem. They're the solution trying to emerge. Your psyche is trying to save you from wasting the second half of your life maintaining a false identity. The symptoms are the alarm clock. The question is, will you wake up? Most people don't answer the call immediately. Instead, they resist. They fight it. They try desperately to maintain the status quo, to force the symptoms to go away without actually changing anything fundamental. This resistance takes predictable forms. Denial. I'm fine. It's just stress. Once this busy period is over, I'll feel better. You convince yourself the symptoms are temporary, situational, nothing to worry about. You refuse to acknowledge that something fundamental is wrong. Medication. You go to the doctor seeking a pharmaceutical solution. And look, I'm not anti-medication. Sometimes it's necessary and helpful. But when medication is used to suppress the symptoms of awakening, rather than support the process of transformation, it just delays the inevitable. You can numb the pain, but the pain is trying to tell you something crucial. Distraction. You get busier. Take on more projects. Fill every moment with activity so you don't have to feel what you're feeling or think what you're thinking. You become obsessed with fitness, with work, with hobbies, anything to avoid the internal confrontation that's trying to happen. Doubling down. If achievement worked in the first half, you'll achieve more. If service worked, you'll serve more. If control worked, you'll control more. You intensify your first half strategies, hoping that just doing more of what you've always done will make the symptoms go away. It won't. External blame. The problem is my job. The problem is my spouse. The problem is my city, my friends, my circumstances. You become convinced that if you just change something external, you'll feel better. So you make changes, quit the job, end the relationship, move to a new place, only to discover the emptiness followed you. Because it was never about external circumstances. Jung observed that this resistance stage can last years. Some people spend their entire 40s and 50s in resistance, refusing to acknowledge what's actually happening. They medicate, distract, blame, and deny until the symptoms become so severe they can't be ignored anymore, or until the symptoms manifest as serious illness, addiction, or complete breakdown. The tragedy of prolonged resistance is that you're fighting against your own healing. The symptoms are trying to help you. The restlessness is trying to move you toward authenticity. The depression is trying to show you that your current life is deadening. The anxiety is trying to alert you that time is running out. But instead of listening, you're trying to silence the messenger. Stage 2 ends when the resistance finally breaks, when you exhaust yourself trying to maintain the persona, when the symptoms become so severe you can't function, when something happens, a crisis, a loss, a moment of absolute clarity that forces you to finally admit, I cannot continue living this way. Something has to change, and that something is me. This is the stage most people fear most, and it's the stage our culture most pathologizes as midlife crisis. But Jung recognized it as absolutely necessary. The persona must die. The false self must be exposed as false. The mask must shatter. There is no way to individuation that bypasses this death. What does persona death look like? For some people, it's dramatic, the kind of breakdown that's visible to everyone around them. They can't get out of bed. They can't go to work. They have a complete collapse of functioning. Everything they've built seems to fall apart. For others, it's internal, what Jung called secret suffering. Externally, they're still functioning, still going through the motions, but internally, they know the performance is over. They can't believe in the character they're playing anymore. They feel like an imposter in their own life. Either way, stage 3 is characterized by this recognition. I don't know who I am. The identity I've been maintaining isn't real. When I strip away the roles, the achievements, the reputation, the performance, what's left? Who am I beneath the mask? This not knowing is terrifying. Humans crave certainty, and the ego clings to identity. To lose your sense of who you are feels like annihilation. Many people describe it as dying while still alive. Everything you thought you were, the successful professional, the devoted parent, the strong one, the good person, the rebel, the spiritual seeker, whatever your particular persona, suddenly feels like a costume you can't wear anymore. David's story illustrated this perfectly. He couldn't put on his suit and go to the office anymore because the persona of corporate attorney David had shattered. Every time he tried to perform that role, his body revolted. The panic attacks were his psyche screaming, "I will not let you continue this lie." Sarah's story showed the same pattern. Walking out of church mid-sermon wasn't planned. It was the moment her persona of perfect pastor's wife could no longer be maintained. The mask cracked, and she couldn't piece it back together. Jung was very clear. This death is not the end. It's the beginning, but it doesn't feel that way while you're going through it. It feels like your life is falling apart. It feels like you're going insane. It feels like everything you've worked for is collapsing, and in a sense, it is. Everything the false self built is collapsing, but the real you, the authentic self beneath the persona, is still here. It's always been here. It's what's been buried alive for 40 years, and now, finally, it's clawing its way to the surface. Stage 3 is the dark night of the soul, the liminal space between who you were and who you're becoming. The death that must happen before rebirth is possible, and there's no way around it. You can only go through it. Once the persona shatters, you're forced to confront everything that was hidden beneath it. This is the descent into shadow, facing all the parts of yourself you've denied, rejected, and repressed. This stage is messy, painful, and absolutely necessary. You can't become whole by continuing to reject parts of yourself. You have to meet them, acknowledge them, and integrate them. The descent means facing your rage, all the anger you've been suppressing for decades, because angry people aren't acceptable. It means feeling it, expressing it appropriately, and recognizing it as valid information about boundaries that were violated and needs that weren't met. It means facing your grief, all the losses you never let yourself mourn. The unlived life, the abandoned dreams, the relationships that ended, the parts of yourself you killed to be acceptable. You have to grieve what you sacrificed. It means facing your desires, all the wants you deemed selfish or inappropriate or dangerous, the sexual desires that didn't fit your moral framework, the creative longings you called impractical, the spiritual experiences you labeled crazy, the unconventional life paths you rejected as irresponsible. You have to acknowledge, I wanted these things. I still want these things. It means facing your darkness, all the qualities you're ashamed of, your pettiness, your cruelty, your selfishness, your capacity for deception, your judgment, your envy, not to wallow in them, but to acknowledge, yes, this is also me. I am capable of these things. This stage often involves what Jung called active imagination, consciously dialoguing with the parts of yourself you've rejected. You might do this in therapy, in journaling, in meditation, or in creative expression. You give voice to the shadow aspects. What do you want? What are you trying to tell me? What part of me do you represent? The descent also means withdrawing projections. Remember, projection is seeing in others what you can't see in yourself. During the descent, you start recognizing that quality I judge so harshly in others. I have it too. That person I'm obsessed with or triggered by. They're reflecting my shadow. The projection withdrawal is humbling and liberating. You stop making others carry your disowned aspects and start owning them yourself. Stage 4 can last months or years. It's not a single event, but an ongoing process of bringing unconscious material into consciousness. And it's painful. Every time you face something you've denied about yourself, there's shame, there's grief, there's the discomfort of recognizing you're not who you thought you were. But here's what Jung discovered. The shadow isn't as terrible as you feared. Yes, it contains darkness, but it also contains gold. All the positive potentials you rejected, along with the negative. Your creativity, your passion, your aliveness, your authentic desires, they're in the shadow too. Integrating shadow doesn't make you worse, it makes you real. This is the stage where something shifts from purely psychological work to what Jung called numinous experience. Direct encounter with something larger than ego. Jung used the term self with a capital S to distinguish it from the ego's self-concept. The self is the totality of your psyche, the organizing principle of your wholeness, what some traditions call soul or spirit or the divine within. For the first 40 years, ego was in charge. Ego made decisions, ego maintained the persona, ego navigated the world. But the ego, Jung discovered, is actually quite small, just the conscious tip of the psyche. The self is vastly larger, containing conscious and unconscious, personal and collective, ego and shadow, everything. Around this stage of individuation, people often have direct experiences that reveal this larger reality. These experiences vary enormously. Some people have what can only be described as mystical experiences, moments of unity consciousness, where the boundaries of ego dissolve and they experience themselves as part of something infinite. Not drug-induced, though sometimes facilitated by psychedelics in therapeutic contexts, but spontaneous encounters with transcendence. Some people experience profound synchronicities, meaningful coincidences that seem impossible to explain by chance alone. Jung was fascinated by synchronicity, recognizing it as evidence that psyche and world are connected in ways our rational materialist framework can't account for. When synchronicities cluster around this stage of individuation, they often feel like the universe is participating in your transformation. Some people have dreams so vivid and symbolically rich that they recognize them as communications from the self. Jung called these big dreams, dreams that carry archetypal weight, that feel more real than waking life, that change you permanently. Some people have near-death experiences or serious illnesses that shatter their previous understanding of reality and open them to dimensions of existence they'd never conceived. Some people simply have moments of absolute clarity, a knowing that transcends thought, where they see their life, their purpose, their connection to something larger with complete certainty. These moments can last seconds or hours, but they're undeniable and transformative. What all these encounters share is this: they relativize the ego. You recognize viscerally, not just intellectually, that you are not just your conscious mind. You are something vastly larger. The ego you've been so invested in maintaining is just a small part of a much bigger wholeness. And that wholeness, the self, has its own wisdom, its own direction, its own purpose that may be completely different from what your ego planned. This encounter is both humbling and liberating. Humbling because you realize how small and limited your conscious understanding has been. Liberating because you're no longer carrying the burden of having to figure everything out, control everything, make everything happen through willpower alone. There's a larger intelligence operating, and you can learn to cooperate with it rather than fight it. Jung called this shift ego-self-axis. The ego remains functional and necessary, but it's no longer the dictator. It becomes the servant of the self. Your conscious mind learns to listen to and cooperate with the deeper wisdom of your totality. For many people, this is the most profound and transformative stage. It's where individuation moves from psychological work to spiritual transformation, where you stop just adjusting your personality and start aligning with your purpose, where life stops being something you're managing and starts being something you're participating in. After the encounter with the self, you face the practical work of integration, taking everything you've discovered in the descent and incorporating it into your actual daily life. This is where transformation becomes embodied rather than just experienced. Integration means making conscious choices based on your authentic self rather than your persona. It means changing how you actually live. If you've discovered buried creativity, integration means actually creating, painting, writing, music, whatever form calls you, not just thinking about it or taking a workshop. If you've discovered suppressed anger, integration means setting boundaries you've never set before, saying no, confronting injustice, refusing to be disrespected. If you've discovered your true desires are different from the goals you inherited, integration means changing your life to honor those desires, even if it means disappointing others, losing status, or starting over. If you've discovered you've been living someone else's values, integration means identifying your own values and reorganizing your life around them. Integration is where many people get stuck. They have insights, they do therapy, they have profound experiences, but then they don't actually change their behavior. They don't let the transformation touch their daily choices. They collect insights like trophies, but continue living the same way. Jung was fierce about this. Individuation isn't just about having realizations. It's about becoming different. It's about embodying your wholeness in actual choices, actual relationships, actual work, actual life. This might mean leaving or radically renegotiating relationships that were built on your false self, changing careers to align with your authentic gifts rather than inherited expectations, setting boundaries with family members who want you to remain the person you were, developing aspects of yourself, creativity, spirituality, physicality, intellect. You've neglected simplifying your life to focus on what actually matters rather than what looks impressive. Speaking your truth even when it makes others uncomfortable. Pursuing goals that reflect your actual values rather than collective measures of success. Integration doesn't mean blowing up your entire life impulsively. Sometimes radical external changes are necessary. Often they're not. What must change is internal. Your relationship to your choices, your willingness to prioritize authenticity over approval, your commitment to living from self rather than persona. The key question of integration: am I actually different or am I just thinking differently? Have my choices changed? Have my relationships changed? Has my daily life changed? If not, integration hasn't happened yet. This final stage is where you emerge as an individuated person, no longer identified with your persona, no longer controlled by your shadow, no longer living for collective approval or external validation. You're living from your center, from the self, from your authentic being. What does this look like practically? First, you have internal authority. Your sense of rightness comes from inside rather than outside. You don't need others to validate your choices or approve of your life. You've developed your own moral compass, your own sense of meaning, your own connection to what matters. This doesn't mean you're isolated or arrogant. It means you're no longer enslaved to others' opinions. Second, you can hold paradox and complexity. The persona demands simplicity. You're good or bad, successful or failed, right or wrong. But wholeness includes contradiction. You can be generous and selfish, strong and vulnerable, serious and playful. You don't need to split yourself or others into categories. You can hold the both, and rather than forcing everything into either or. Third, you've withdrawn your projections. You see people as they actually are rather than as screens for your unconscious material. This makes relationships more real, sometimes more difficult, because you can't idealize anymore, but definitely more authentic. Fourth, you've developed relationship with your unconscious. You pay attention to dreams. You notice synchronicities. You recognize when shadow material is erupting. You've learned to dialogue with the parts of yourself that operate below consciousness. You're no longer purely identified with ego. Fifth, you're creative in a broad sense, not necessarily artistically, though often that too, but creative in how you live. You're authoring your own life rather than following someone else's script. You're making choices that are uniquely yours rather than conventional responses to circumstances. Sixth, you contribute wisdom rather than seeking validation. You've stopped trying to prove yourself. The desperate need for recognition, achievement, status, it's gone or greatly diminished. Instead, you're interested in offering what you've learned, in being of service from your authentic gifts rather than your persona performance. Seventh, and this is crucial, you're preparing for death. Not morbidly, but consciously. You recognize your mortality not as tragedy, but as the context that makes life meaningful. Jung insisted the second half of life is inherently about preparing for death, and people who individuate successfully lose their terror of it. Not because they believe in any particular afterlife, but because they've lived. They've been real. They've existed as themselves. So death becomes completion rather than cancellation. This is the rebirth Jung spoke about. Not a return to who you were before, but emergence as who you actually are. The person you were always meant to be beneath all the layers of conditioning, expectation, and performance. Life finally feels real at this stage because you're finally real. You're not performing anymore. You're not maintaining a mask. You're not seeking approval or avoiding rejection. You're just being fully, authentically, unapologetically yourself. And here's what Jung discovered that might surprise you. Individuated people aren't weird, isolated eccentrics. They're often more relational, more compassionate, more engaged with life than they were before. Because when you stop performing and start being, you're actually more available for genuine connection. When you stop projecting and start seeing clearly, you're more capable of love. When you stop seeking approval and start living authentically, you paradoxically become more valuable to others. Not as someone who meets their expectations, but as someone who models what authentic existence looks like. These 7 stages aren't perfectly linear. You don't complete one and neatly move to the next. You might cycle through them multiple times. You might be in stage 5 with one aspect of yourself and stage 2 with another. But the overall arc is clear, from unconscious living to conscious being, from persona to self, from performance to authenticity, from ego inflation to ego integration. Jung's roadmap gives you orientation. When you're in stage 3 feeling like your life is falling apart, you can know. This is the breakdown that precedes breakthrough. This is necessary. When you're in stage 4 facing your shadow and feeling ashamed, you can know this is the descent that leads to wholeness. This is how healing happens. The question is, where are you right now? Can you identify your current stage? And more importantly, are you willing to continue the journey? Or will you get stuck in resistance, refusing the call, maintaining the persona until you die, without ever having truly lived. Jung's map is an invitation and a warning. The invitation, you can become who you actually are. The warning, it will cost you everything the false self built. But what it gives you, authenticity, wholeness, a life that finally feels real, is worth infinitely more than what it costs. There comes a moment in the architecture of a human life when the walls you have built with such care, brick by careful brick, year by patient year, begin to tremble. Not from any external storm, not from the cruelties of circumstance or the failures you can name and categorize. No, this trembling rises from within, from a place you have not visited in so long you've forgotten it exists. It is the rumbling of something buried, something true, something that has been waiting in the darkness of your own depths, watching as you performed the elaborate theater of becoming. At 40, or near enough to that symbolic threshold, life performs its most intimate betrayal. The masks you wore with such conviction, the professional self, the parent, the partner, the success, the person who has it all together. These personas that once fit like skin now hang loose and strange, like costumes you've outgrown but cannot quite bring yourself to remove. You look in the mirror and see the face you've always known, yet behind the eyes, there is a stranger stirring, someone who has been sleeping beneath the floorboards of your consciousness, and now, at last, is beginning to wake. Carl Jung understood this moment with the precision of a cartographer, mapping the territory of the soul. He called it the arch of life's afternoon, that meridian point where the sun, having reached its zenith, begins its inevitable descent toward the horizon. In the morning of life, we climb, we accumulate, we build our fortresses of identity from the stones of others' expectations, from the blueprints society hands us at birth. We are told who to become, and we become it with such dedication, such fierce determination, that we forget to ask whether this person we are becoming bears any resemblance to the person we truly are. But the afternoon demands a different pilgrimage. The direction reverses. The journey that was once aimed at conquest of the outer world now spirals inward into territories unmapped and undefended. The questions that were easy to ignore in youth: who am I beyond what I do? What does my life mean beyond what I've achieved? What have I sacrificed to become acceptable? These questions return with the weight of prophecy, with the insistence of something that will no longer be denied. This is the sacred unraveling, though it rarely feels sacred when you are inside it. It feels like failure. It feels like the ground giving way beneath your feet, like everything you built your life upon was constructed on sand, on illusion, on the flimsiest of foundations. You may find yourself weeping without knowing why. You may wake at 3 a.m. with your heart pounding, gripped by an unnamed dread that has nothing to do with your mortgage or your marriage or your health, and everything to do with the sudden, vertigo-inducing realization that you have been living someone else's life, that you have been reading from a script you did not write. The ego, that necessary structure of consciousness that carried you this far, that gave you the coherence to function in the world, discovers it is not alone in the house of the self. There is another presence, vast and ancient, stirring in the basement, moving through the walls. Jung called it the self with a capital S, that totality of being that encompasses both consciousness and the unconscious, both the known and the unknown, both the person you present to the world and the person you have hidden even from yourself. The self is not interested in your accomplishments. It is not impressed by your titles or your bank account or the approval you've earned from others. The self wants only one thing: to be lived, to be embodied, to be brought into the light of consciousness and integrated into the wholeness of who you are. But integration requires breakdown first. The vessel must crack before new wine can be poured in. The seed must split before the green shoot can emerge. You cannot become whole without first encountering your fragmentation. You cannot integrate what you have not acknowledged. And so the afternoon of life begins with what feels like dissolution, with the careful dismantling of all the certainties you clung to in the morning. Perhaps it begins with a question you cannot shake. Is this all there is? You have reached the summit of what you were told to want, the career, the family, the house, the life that looks from the outside like success. And yet there is a hollowness at the center, an echo where there should be fullness. You followed the map you were given, arrived at the destination marked X, and discovered that the treasure was not there, or worse, that you no longer remember what treasure you were seeking in the first place. Perhaps it begins with the return of old dreams, those aspirations you buried in your 20s because they were impractical, unrealistic, not suitable for a responsible adult. The painter you never became, the writer whose voice was silenced by the need to be sensible, the wanderer who was convinced to settle down. These ghost selves begin to haunt you, not with accusation but with longing, whispering that it is not too late, that there is still time, that the unlived life is still there waiting to be claimed. Perhaps it begins with an affair, not necessarily of the body, though that too is common at this crossroads, but an affair with possibility itself, with the sudden recognition that you could make different choices, that you could walk away from the life you've constructed and build something new, something more true. This recognition is terrifying and intoxicating in equal measure. It reveals how much of your life has been lived on autopilot, how many of your days have been spent merely maintaining rather than truly living. Or perhaps it begins with loss. A parent dies, a marriage ends, a job disappears, and suddenly the scaffolding that held you upright is gone. You are forced to stand on your own, without the external structures that defined you, and you discover that you're not quite sure who you are when no one is watching, when no one needs you to be anything in particular. The unconscious does not speak in the language of logic. It speaks in symptoms, in synchronicities, in dreams that wake you gasping, in slips of the tongue, in the depression that descends like fog, in the anxiety that grips you for no reason you can name. It speaks in the body, the back that goes out, the fatigue that will not lift, the illness that forces you to stop, to rest, to turn your attention inward when you have spent decades facing outward. Jung knew that these symptoms are not enemies to be medicated away or powered through. They are messengers from the interior, emissaries from the realm of the self, bearing news that the ego does not want to hear, that the life you are living is too small for the soul you contain, that there are parts of yourself you have disowned that are demanding to be recognized, that the persona you present to the world has become a prison rather than a protection. The persona, that social mask Jung described, that carefully curated version of ourselves we show to others, serves a vital function in youth. It allows us to navigate the world, to fulfill our roles, to meet expectations. But what begins as a useful adaptation can calcify into a cage. We become so identified with the mask that we forget there is a face beneath it. We confuse the role we play with the reality of who we are. The successful businessman forgets there is a man beneath the success. The devoted mother forgets there is a woman beneath the devotion. The strong one forgets there is vulnerability beneath the strength. At midlife, the persona begins to crack. The mask slips, and beneath it, there is not emptiness, but a face you have not seen in decades. Your own face, unedited, unperformed, raw with longing, and alive with possibility. This is the face that knows what you truly value, what truly matters, what you would do if you were not afraid, if you were not trying to be good, if you were not performing for an invisible audience that never stops judging. The crisis of midlife is not, as our culture would have us believe, a pathology to be fixed with a sports car or a new romance or a desperate attempt to recapture youth. It is an initiation, a threshold, a death that precedes rebirth. It is the moment when the soul refuses to be ignored any longer, when the unlived life rises up and demands its due, when the unconscious breaks through the defenses of the ego and floods consciousness with everything we have been denying, avoiding, repressing. This is not comfortable. Initiation never is. The descent into the underworld of the self requires courage of a kind we were never taught in school, a willingness to sit with uncertainty, to endure the darkness, to meet the parts of ourselves we have spent our lives running from. The shadow, all those qualities we rejected, all those impulses we judged as unacceptable, waits in this darkness, not as an enemy but as an exiled part of ourselves seeking to come home. You may encounter rage you did not know you carried, grief for all the years you were not yourself, shame for all the ways you betrayed your own knowing, desire that was never allowed expression, creativity that was never permitted to flourish, power that was never claimed, softness that was never shown. All the opposites you split apart in order to fit into the narrow corridor of acceptability. They all live in the shadow, and they all want to be integrated into the wholeness of who you are. The unraveling feels like catastrophe while you are inside it, but it is actually grace. It is the psyche's way of correcting course, of bringing you back to yourself, of stripping away what is false so that what is true can finally emerge. The anxiety, the depression, the sense that everything is falling apart. These are not signs of weakness or failure. They are signs that you are strong, enough now to face what you could not face before, that your ego has developed enough stability to withstand the encounter with the unconscious, that you are finally ready to become who you actually are rather than who you thought you should be. At 40, life stops pretending. The polite fictions we maintained in youth, that we can have it all, that we can be everything to everyone, that success will satisfy the soul's hunger, these fictions dissolve. What remains is the raw truth of being human, that we are finite creatures with infinite longings, that every choice means the death of other possibilities, that becoming one thing means not becoming 1,000 others. This is the wisdom of limitation, the strange gift of the afternoon. In youth, all paths seem open. At midlife, you must choose which path is yours, must accept that you cannot live every life, must grieve the selves you will never become so you can fully inhabit the self you are. This is not resignation, it is clarification. It is the distillation of essence from the chaos of possibility. The self that stirs in the depths is not concerned with your resume. It wants to know, have you lived your own life or the life others expected of you? Have you followed your own desire or desire shaped by fear and conformity? Have you listened to the still, small voice within or only to the loud demands without? These questions cannot be answered with the rational mind. They require a descent into the irrational, into the realm of dreams and symbols, into the territory where the soul speaks in images and myths. This is why Jung turned to alchemy, to fairy tales, to the great religious traditions, not as literal truths, but as symbolic maps of the individuation process, that lifelong journey towards psychological wholeness. The heroes of myth do not achieve their transformation through more success or more achievement. They achieve it through descent, through facing the dragon in the cave, through the dark night of the soul, through symbolic death and resurrection. At midlife, you are the hero called to your own underworld. The call may come as crisis or as quiet discontent, as sudden upheaval or as slow erosion. But it comes if you are paying attention, and the only mistake you can make is to refuse the call, to cling to the old persona, to try to force the second half of life to follow the script of the first. The afternoon of life demands a different kind of strength, not the strength to achieve, but the strength to let go. Not the strength to build, but the strength to tear down what no longer serves. Not the strength to add more, but the strength to subtract what is false, until only the essential remains. This is the work of individuation, and it begins here, in the trembling, in the unraveling, in the sacred crisis that announces, you are ready now. The self is calling. The awakening has begun. In the second half of life, the question transforms. No longer are you asking, what shall I become? The morning's relentless striving toward an imagined future self, the successful, the admired, the accomplished, gives way to something more profound, more elemental. The question now is, who have I always been beneath the becoming? What essential nature was buried under the accumulation of roles and achievements and adaptations? The task is no longer to construct a self, but to excavate one, to remember rather than to invent, to return rather than to arrive. Jung named this process individuation, and in that single word lies the entire journey of the soul's afternoon. It is not a project of self-improvement, though our culture will try to reduce it to that. It is not about becoming a better version of the self you've been performing. It is something far more radical, far more dangerous, far more true. It is the alchemical transformation of lead into gold, the integration of all the scattered fragments of your being into one coherent whole, the reconciliation of warring opposites within the single vessel of your consciousness. It is the work of becoming undivided, of claiming sovereignty over the inner kingdom that you have allowed to fall into chaos and civil war. This is not a comfortable process. Comfort is the currency of the first half of life, where we build our fortresses of security, our moats of protection, our walls of propriety. But individuation requires that we walk out of the fortress, unarmed and uncertain, into the wilderness of our own interior. It requires that we descend into the personal underworld we have spent decades avoiding, that we face the rejected parts of ourselves, that we exiled to the shadows because they were too messy, too dark, too wild, too vulnerable, too powerful to be allowed into the light of acceptable selfhood. The shadow, that Jungian concept so often misunderstood as simply our dark side, is actually far more complex and far more holy than such reductions suggest. The shadow is not merely our capacity for cruelty or our socially unacceptable impulses. It is everything we had to deny, repress, or disown in order to survive our childhood, to earn love, to fit into our family system, to navigate our culture's narrow definitions of acceptability. For some, the shadow contains rage and aggression, the power that was forbidden. For others, it contains softness and need, the vulnerability that was shamed. For still others, it contains creativity, sexuality, ambition, joy, whatever qualities the ego decided were too dangerous to acknowledge. At midlife, these exiled parts begin to revolt. They will no longer remain in the basement of consciousness. They want recognition. They want integration. They want to be brought home to the wholeness of who you are. And so they manifest in dreams, vivid, unsettling dreams, where you encounter figures who represent what you have rejected. They manifest in projections. You find yourself intensely attracted to or repulsed by people who carry the qualities you cannot acknowledge in yourself. They manifest in slips of the tongue, in sudden outbursts of emotion, in the eruption of behavior that seems utterly unlike you, precisely because it is the you that you have refused to be. Jung understood that we cannot become whole by remaining divided, by continuing to split the world into acceptable and unacceptable, good and evil, light and dark. The work of individuation is the work of reconciliation, of bringing the opposites into conversation, of discovering that the qualities we most despise often contain the energy we most need. The man who rejects his sensitivity may discover that his capacity for depth and connection lives in that very sensitivity. The woman who denies her aggression may find that her power to protect herself and others resides in that very fierceness. The person who has been performing niceness their entire life may need to integrate their capacity to say no, to disappoint, to claim their own desires even when it makes others uncomfortable. This is the hero's return, but not in the way our myths have taught us to imagine it. The hero of the first half of life goes out into the world to slay dragons, to win treasure, to prove their worth through conquest of external challenges. But the hero of the second half of life turns inward, descends rather than ascends, and discovers that the real dragon lives within, not as an enemy to be slain, but as a guardian of something precious that was locked away for safekeeping. The treasure is not gold or glory. The treasure is your own unlived life, your own authentic nature, your own soul waiting to be claimed. At 40, you are called to become the ruler of your inner kingdom rather than a subject in someone else's empire. For so long, you have lived according to external authorities, the voices of parents, teachers, culture, religion, all the systems that told you who to be and how to live. These voices were not necessarily wrong. They helped you develop the ego strength needed to function in the world. But now, they must be relativized, must be understood as one set of perspectives among many, must be weighed against the authority of your own inner knowing. This is the birth of the inner king, the inner queen, the sovereign self that can rule the interior realm with wisdom and compassion. But sovereignty cannot be claimed without first recognizing how much of your life has been lived in service to false rulers. How much energy have you given to trying to please people who will never be satisfied? How many decisions have you made from fear rather than desire? How many times have you silenced your own knowing because it contradicted what you were supposed to think, feel, or want? The process of individuation asks you to retrieve your projections, to take back the authority you have granted to others. This does not mean becoming selfish or narcissistic. It means becoming responsible for your own life in a way you could not be when you were young. It means acknowledging that no one else can live your life for you, that no external achievement can fill the internal void, that no relationship can complete you if you remain divided within yourself. Jung spoke of the conjunctio, the mystical marriage of opposites, within the individual psyche. This is not merely a metaphor. It is the actual work of integrating masculine and feminine, thinking and feeling, strength and vulnerability, light and shadow. For men, this often means encountering the anima, the inner feminine that carries qualities of relatedness, emotion, intuition, all the capacities that patriarchal culture teaches men to reject. For women, it means encountering the animus, the inner masculine that carries qualities of agency, assertion, clarity, all the powers that culture has taught women to suppress. But these are not rigid categories. Each individual carries their own unique constellation of opposites that must be reconciled. The intellectual who must integrate the body, the achiever who must learn to simply be, the caretaker who must claim their own needs, the rationalist who must admit the irrational, the believer who must doubt, the skeptic who must wonder, the independent one who must learn to need, the dependent one who must find their autonomy. This integration does not happen through willpower or through the methods that worked in youth. You cannot achieve individuation the way you achieved your degree or your promotion. It requires a different kind of knowing, a different kind of doing. It requires what Jung called active imagination, a willingness to enter into dialogue with the unconscious, to treat your dreams and fantasies as real communications from real parts of yourself, to listen to the symbolic language of the psyche. It requires that you pay attention to what captures you, what disturbs you, what won't leave you alone. The book you keep thinking about, the memory that keeps returning, the desire that won't be quieted, the grief that won't be consoled. These are not distractions from the real work of life. They are the real work, the soul's curriculum, the specific lessons your psyche is trying to teach you. At midlife, many people discover practices they had dismissed in youth. Meditation, dream work, therapy, creative expression, time in nature, solitude. Not because these practices make you more productive or successful, but because they create space for the self to speak, for the unconscious to be heard, for the unlived life to begin living. The frenetic pace of the first half of life often served as a defense against interiority. If you stay busy enough, you don't have to feel. If you achieve enough, you don't have to ask whether achievement matters. If you maintain the performance, you don't have to meet what lies beneath the mask. But the afternoon of life will not tolerate such evasions indefinitely. The body slows down, whether you want it to or not. Energy becomes more precious, more finite. You can no longer do everything, be everything, say yes to everyone. This limitation, which the ego experiences as loss, the self experiences as clarification. What truly matters begins to separate from what merely seemed important. The essential begins to emerge from the clutter of the incidental. This is where the real freedom lives, not in having more options, but in knowing which options are yours. Not in being able to do anything, but in choosing to do the things that align with your deepest values, your truest self. The second half of life offers the gift of focus, the relief of knowing what you can let go, the peace of accepting that you are not required to live every possible life, only your own. Jung understood that individuation is not a solitary journey, though it requires solitude. As you become more whole within yourself, you become more capable of genuine relationship with others. The persona-to-persona interactions of youth, where we meet each other through our masks, our roles, our performances, can give way to something more authentic. When you are no longer defending against your own shadow, you can meet others without projection. When you have claimed your own authority, you can encounter others as equals rather than as parents or saviors or enemies. When you have integrated your own opposites, you can hold space for complexity in others. This is the birth of true intimacy, not the merger of youth where we seek completion in another, but the meeting of two whole beings who choose each other from fullness rather than from need. It is also the birth of genuine solitude, not the loneliness of disconnection, but the capacity to be alone with yourself and find that presence nourishing rather than empty. The awakening that happens at 40 is not sudden illumination, not the dramatic lightning bolt of spiritual realization. It is something quieter and more profound, a gradual dawn that reveals the landscape you have been walking through in darkness. It is the recognition that meaning is not found in what you achieve, but in who you are becoming. Not in the external markers of success, but in the internal integrity of living from your own center, your own truth, your own authority. Life finally feels real at 40 because you are finally living it from the inside out rather than the outside in. You are no longer waiting for permission, no longer performing for approval, no longer constructing a self from the blueprints others provided. You are listening to the still, small voice that was always there, beneath the noise, beneath the striving, beneath the fear. You are following the thread of your own desire, your own meaning, your own unique path toward wholeness. This does not mean you suddenly have all the answers. Individuation is not about certainty. It is about the courage to live the questions, to embrace the paradox, to hold the tension of opposites, without collapsing into either extreme. It is about becoming comfortable with ambiguity, with mystery, with not knowing. The ego wants resolution, wants clarity, wants to arrive at a final destination. But the self knows that the journey is the destination, that wholeness is not a static state, but a dynamic process of continuous integration. Jung spoke of an antiodromia, the principle that everything eventually becomes its opposite. The sun that rose must set. The tide that flowed must ebb. The self that expanded must contract. The strength that served must soften. The identity that protected must dissolve. This is not failure. This is the rhythm of wholeness, the natural oscillation between opposites that characterizes all living systems. To individuate is to learn to move with this rhythm rather than against it, to accept that life is not linear progress, but spiral descent and ascent, death and rebirth, unraveling and reweaving. At last, you understand that you are not here to be perfect, but to be whole, not to be invulnerable, but to be authentic, not to have it all figured out, but to keep figuring it out with courage and curiosity, not to be someone else's idea of successful, but your own definition of meaningful. The inner king, the inner queen, rules not through domination but through integration, not through control but through compassion, not through forcing but through allowing. This is the sovereignty you were always meant to claim. Not power over others but authority over your own life. Not the right to dominate the outer world, but the responsibility to order the inner one. Not the conquest of external territory, but the cultivation of internal landscape. The kingdom you inherit at midlife is vast beyond measure, containing multitudes stretching into dimensions you never knew existed, and the throne you ascend to is not above others, but within yourself. At 40, the spirit awakens because you are finally ready to bear the weight of your own soul, to carry the complexity of your own being, to live the fullness of your own truth. The persona cracks not to destroy you, but to liberate you. The descent into the underworld is not punishment, but pilgrimage. The sacred unraveling is not the end, but the beginning. You are being born again, not into a new role or a better version of the old self, but into the person you have always been, beneath all the becoming. You are coming home to yourself, and in that homecoming, life stops being a performance and becomes, finally, gloriously, terrifyingly, beautifully real.